Well, good morning, and can I welcome everyone to this, the 24th meeting of the Public Audit Committee in 2025. We've received apologies this morning from Joe Fitzpatrick, and I'd like to welcome Keith Brown, who has joined us this morning as Joe Fitzpatrick's substitute. Can I begin, Keith, by asking you if there are any relevant interests that you wish to declare?
Thanks, Convener. I have no relevant interests to declare.
Thank you very much indeed. We'll now move on to agenda item, the next consideration for the committee. Before we do that is to agree or not to take agenda items 4, 5 and 6 in private this morning. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you very much. So we'll then now turn to agenda item 2, which is consideration of a mini inquiry that the committee wishes to proceed with, looking at the Cairngorm Funicular Railway. And so I'm very pleased to welcome witnesses to the Public Audit Committee this morning. We're joined by Stuart Black, who is the Chief Executive of Highlands and Isles Enterprise, and along with Mr Black is Sandra Dunbar, who is a Director of Corporate Services at HI, and Elaine Hanton, who is the Cairngorm Programme Lead at HI. We're also joined this morning by representatives from the Cairngorm Mountain Scotland Limited company, which is a subsidiary of Highlands and Isles Enterprise. So I'm very pleased to welcome the Chief Executive of that organisation, Mike Gifford. Morning, Mr Gifford. And also Tim Hurst, who is the former Interim Chief Executive and a board member of Cairngorm Mountain Scotland Limited. We've got some questions to put to you this morning, but before we get to those, Mr Black, could I invite you to make a short opening statement?
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, members. Thank you for the opportunity to attend committee today to discuss matters relating to Cairngorm Mountain. Highlands and Islands Enterprise is the owner and custodian of the 3,500-acre Cairngorm estate, which sits within the UK's largest national park. The estate is bordered by several sites officially designated for environmental protection and scientific interest, and is both an environmental and economic asset for Scotland, and particularly for the local area of Strathspey and Badenoch. Cairngorm Mountain Resort has for decades been a significant Scottish visitor attraction and economic driver for the local area and the wider Highlands, and it features Scotland's only funicular railway. The funicular provides mountain access for skiers and snowboarders in winter and for sightseers of a range of ages and abilities in all seasons. Crucially, the resort supports year-round tourism employment in contrast to marked seasonality elsewhere in the region. Approximately 72 people are employed at Cairngorm Mountain in the summer, a figure which rises to around 100 in winter, generating £1.8 million a year in gross wages to the local economy. As committee is aware, we have faced serious challenges at Cairngorm since September 2018, when the funicular was taken out of service following a routine inspection which raised safety concerns. I want to stress that safety has always been our paramount consideration in the operation of Cairngorm and the funicular. Shortly after this, the then operating company was put into administration, and HIE established Cairngorm Mountain Scotland Limited to maintain operations and secure not just the jobs on the mountain, but the wider economic benefits that are underpinned by its activities. Details of subsequent events and decisions and actions that followed are summarised in our written submission, and I won't repeat them now. What I do want to emphasise is the importance of the resort and the funicular in generating wider economic benefits in an area that has a high dependency on tourism. 30% of the economy is dependent on tourism, one of the highest figures in Scotland. And that is a key factor underpinning our rationale for investment over the years and at the moment. Analysis by ourselves suggests that shows that the annual number of visitors attracted to Cairngorm Mountain when the funicular was running totalled since 2017 132,851 on average. The annual spend attributed to funicular visitors is estimated at £10.2 million, and this activity supports 123 jobs in the local economy, with wages totalling £2.2 million and gross value added of £3.8. Cairngorm Mountain Scotland Limited has broadened the range of activities to attract customers to Cairngorm, and I'm sure Mike is going to talk more about this later. We're trying to attract visitors throughout the year, whilst also maintaining a focus on winter sports and environmental protection and education, and we deliver that through a dedicated ranger service. The rangers play a key role in environmental protection and enhancement and education, including 30 kilometres of footpaths around the mountainside. We've added a lot of attractions in recent years, including children's tube sliding, an adventure park, mountain biking trails and mountain karting, and all have proven popular, strengthening the resort's year-round appeal. HIE has also invested in infrastructure, including improvements to car parking, refurbishment of the exhibition, enhancement of the retail and food and drink facilities in the ptarmigan and camper van facilities. In addition, over 33,000 trees have been planted to develop a new forest on the estate. I'd also like to highlight that HIE was successful in gaining £11 million in an out-of-court settlement after bringing legal cases against the original designer and contractor of the funicular, as well as the parent of the operating company and the principal shareholder. As committee is aware, there are still some remediation works to be concluded before we can progress discussions to close the contract with our main contractor. We may therefore be unable to provide certain details at this time. However, we do aim to be as open as possible and will be pleased to follow up in due course with any information we're unable to provide today. Lastly, I would like to reiterate that HIE and CMSL would be pleased to host a visit to Cairngorm by the committee members and facilitate meetings with stakeholders at the earliest opportunity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed. Just before we get on to our questions, could you perhaps just summarise for us from September 2018, when the funicular was closed for reasons of safety, when has it been opened since then?
The funicular there was a significant amount of repair work to be done to the structure, remediation work to be done to the structure. It did open for a short period in 2023, between January and August, and then routine inspections at that point again highlighted some issues, and therefore it was closed on safety grounds. So there's been a 6 months period between January 23 and August 23, and then subsequently it's been opened this year, since it opened in February this year. And then it's been running quite successfully, and in fact it's had something like 70,000 visitors this year, which is really positive.
Okay, again, I read somewhere that it was closed in May 2025.
There was a short period of closure, sorry, yes. There was a 3-week period of closure in May 25 for some additional works.
Okay, and then more scheduled closures in September and November of this year?
There's a short scheduled closure next week for 3 days, and then in November there's usually a routine maintenance period in November anyway, and that period, actually it usually is a bit longer. It's just going to be for 1 week.
Okay, so these are routine maintenance shutdowns. They're not substantive structural engineering issues.
The closure next week is to deal with some final remediation issues. The one in November may also deal with some of those, but they're not substantive. They're relatively minor. There's nothing to concern the committee in terms of the structure. It's really about minor remediation works.
Yeah, we're not the Health and Safety Committee, we're the Public Audit Committee,
yes.
So
Yep.
we'll try and focus our attention on that. But I just wanted to get that picture because, again, if the area is being presented as a tourist destination and people expect that facility to be there as part of the attraction of going there, if when they arrive it's closed, that's quite a damaging, has quite a damaging impact on the reputation of the area, doesn't it?
There's certainly a disappointment when the funicular isn't running, and on the contrary, when it is running, there's a real boost to the local economy in terms of confidence and business confidence, community confidence. So our aim and the company's aim is to make sure that it's running and operating effectively.
Okay, let me turn then to issues of governance and oversight. How does HIE ensure that it's got effective oversight of the Cairngorm Mountain project and those who are running it? How does that work?
So we have a range of internal project management committees and project teams within the organisation. We also report regularly to our main board. Our main board meets 6 times a year, and we always have a report on Cairngorm Mountain. And we also report to our own RAC committee, which is our audit committee. In fact, it meets tomorrow, and we'll have a Cairngorm paper at that. So there's a variety of different project governance at different levels through the organisation. There's also reporting between HIE and Cairngorm Mountain. We have KPIs, a number of KPIs with them that we monitor on a monthly basis. And then in terms of the project itself, we're using an NEC contract, and that's a very well rehearsed and well used type of contract within civil engineering in Scotland.
Okay. I mean, I don't know whether one of the witnesses wants to come in. Yes, please do. Yeah.
If that's okay to add to that. So, as Stuart said, just to maybe highlight, we've got different layers of governance. So within HIE itself, we've got a programme board of really experienced executives who are responsible for the oversight of all aspects of the Cairngorm programme, which isn't just the funicular remediation work. It is also around the wider diversification activity and the management of the operating company. So we have a programme board, we also have a funicular project board as well that oversees all of that activity. And then at a more strategic level, the High Board receive updates, as Stuart says, regularly. Our Audit Committee, which is a Risk and Assurance Committee, similarly receive updates as well. And we also have a board subgroup, which we convened specifically for the special purpose of supporting and advising on issues relating to Cairngorm. The project in Cairngorm is sufficiently high risk that we've added additional governance to support the effective activity that we're doing there. I think also that within CMSL, there's and we sought to work with them very closely to make sure there's good governance within CMSL. So a really good experienced senior team with the Chief Executive newly appointed as well through Mike, but also a board that represents the experience and capabilities needed to take the company through the periods of challenge and diversification. But as Stuart, you also said, the project, the funicular remediation project, has got different layers of governance supporting issues such as technical, health and safety, environmental activity as well. And maybe the last thing to say on governance is we also have some formal stakeholder groups. So the Cairngorm Advisory Group, which was an evolution from a funicular response group that we put in place in 2018. So I think we've tried to make sure that we've got really good governance that demonstrates and meets all the requirements of Cairngorm in the widest sense, I think.
Yeah. I mean, on first viewing, there seems like quite a proliferation of governance and lots of different committees and programme boards and so on. I suppose the question is that the most effective way of providing the oversight that's required? And I think from the Public Audit Committee's point of view, it would be useful, I think, to have a diagram which shows how those different parts of governance fit together and what their different roles are. Before I invite other members of the committee to come in, the other question, I suppose, which arises is, to what extent is this structure the product of lessons learned from the previous private contractor who was providing the services, Nail?
There's certainly a higher degree of scrutiny on the project. It features regularly on our risk register as well. I think that was one thing Sandra didn't mention. It's pretty much at the top of our organisational risk register. We certainly took away the Audit Committee reports and Audit Scotland reports from previous exercises and looked at that very closely. And I think we've got very strong project governance in. We've involved our board as much as we can, and we also have regular liaison with Audit Scotland as well, because it's clearly a nationally important project.
OK, I'm now going to invite Keith Brown to put some questions to you. Keith.
Thank you. I should say I'm the new boy in the committee, so my questions might not be exactly as they should be, but just a couple of points you made. You've just said how you work with Audit Scotland. I just wonder, how does HIE respond to concerns about transparency and accountability? You'll know that there were issues raised in previous reviews. Just maybe if you could just outline what those concerns were and how you've responded to them.
I might get Sandra to come in on this one, if that's okay. Thanks.
So a key finding in the Audit Scotland review was encouraging us to be more open around our engagement, particularly with wider stakeholders. So a couple of things we have done there is that we do have a stakeholder group with representatives from the community and business with an interest in Cairngorm. So that meets regularly and it's co-chaired by the Highland Council convener and the High Chair. So that is an excellent forum for the two-way communication. It's not just us communicating what we're doing, it's actually engaging. We've also done significant consultation as a result of the master planning exercise, and Elaine might want to talk more about that. But also in terms of wider transparency, we have sought through particularly to be as open as we can around the communication of our business decisions, the papers and that support that, and to be as open as we can in response to, for example, freedom of information requests, but to be more proactive around presenting our business cases, so they are on our website. So we've done different layers of being openness, and you'll see quite prominent feature, I think, in our annual reports on what we've done at Cairngorm and the costs, etc., associated with that. So I think there's probably different levels of openness and transparency, and we have reflected on the findings of the Audit Scotland reviews.
If I maybe pick up on the point about the master plan, so that was a almost 2-year process we went through, which involved consultation and running consultation events locally. We, in the end, I think we had 2 different consultation stages. We ended up with over 2,000 consultation responses, and I think we had around 70 stakeholder meetings as part of that as well. So it's really very much about trying to engage with people with an interest, not just locally, but also sporting interests, neighbouring landowners and others as well, to try and ensure that we're taking on board their comments, their feedback, and their learning as well, actually, from what has and hasn't worked for them in the past. Sandra also didn't mention that we've also done a lot of lessons learned specific exercises, including with the Cairngorm Advisory Group that we mentioned earlier. And we've also done the same with members of the CMSL team, ex-members of high staff and others who've been involved in Cairngorm over the years as well. So just to really try and capture what has and hasn't worked and what we really need to bring forward into the future as well. So we really have tried to make sure that we've done all of that.
So given those actions, would you say that you believe that you've met the concerns that were raised previously in relation to transparency and accountability? I know it's an ongoing thing, but would you say...
I think, yeah, I think that's for others to judge, but in terms of what we've done, I think we've actually tried to go to the highest degree in terms of meeting the requirements. I think the other thing I would stress, Convener, is that we've used lessons learned on this project for wider project governance within the organisation. Any major projects now, we've got very clear guidance. We've put a lot of our senior team and senior staff through training as well. So I think it's not just about lessons learned for Cairngorm, it's lessons learned and how we apply them across the organisation.
I suppose it will be for others to judge, but it's useful to know if you yourselves believe that you've met those concerns. I suppose that was the point. And on other recommendations from Audit Scotland and the Auditor General, I mean, there are different views about the impact and the scope of recommendations made by the Auditor General in various ways, but would you consider these have influenced your current practices? Are you able to give any examples of how that's the case, if it is the case?
Yes, I think one of the key things was around the openness and transparency, and we've certainly tried to do that, and as Sandra's mentioned. And I think that's been reflected in support that we have in the local community. So I think at the start there was a fair degree of scepticism about some of the things that were happening on the mountain. And I think now when you speak to the vast majority of people in the local community, they're definitely very supportive of what's been happening at Cairngorm. And Mike is particularly... He's seen to be a very good appointment, and he's been very open and meeting a lot of the local stakeholders. So I think that is one area that we've really strengthened. I think our general project management, sorry, I should have said, of course I believe that we've met the Audit Scotland requirements. Our general project management is well regarded. I think we're seen as an organisation that is effective and efficient, and we've tried to take lessons, as I say, learnt from Cairngorm project management lessons here and apply them wider across the organisation. And we're dealing with many, many big projects at the moment. We have a huge amount of opportunity in our area, particularly around offshore wind. And we're taking some of the learning and experience from projects like Cairngorm and applying them to big projects like the Sumitomo investment at NIG and other projects of that sort of scale.
And last point, Convener, just I was really interested to read about the pursuit of this, the settlement you've had, £11 million or so on, and I think for many people that's quite a reassuring thing to hear about, that public authorities will challenge contracts which haven't been properly delivered. Was there any part of that process that was either informed by or done in conjunction with Audit Scotland? Did they help in relation to that, or was it solely down to HIE taking that forward?
I'll bring Sandra in, but we certainly led on that, and I agree with you. I think it's very important when people in the private sector doesn't deliver for us that we actually take action, and the outcome of that we discussed with our board, we discussed the negotiations with our subgroup, we looked at the order of magnitude of settlement that we might accept, and this was at the top end of where we thought we might get to, so we were very pleased with the result. I think it was a significant result for us. I'll bring Sandra in on the detail.
Yeah, no, we took, I mean, from the outset of the 2018 period where the CML company went into administration and there were challenges, our whole strategy around not just what did we deal with the operating company and the funicular, how did we also preserve and protect our position with respect to any recovery of costs. So we were very considered. We engaged with Audit Scotland and kept them up to date, but as Stuart said, we did lead on that, and but we did take counsel, I suppose, from examples of any other good practice that could be informed, and we had an excellent internal team of experts, but also good legal counsel to support us through that. But it was a factor that ran through all of our decisions around the funicular activity as well.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. I mean, just as a supplementary to that, I mean, to what extent did you get help and support from the Scottish Government's central legal services?
I'll bring Sandra in again, but I think we did get excellent support from our sponsor team and the department. So that's the way we work. We don't tend to work directly with other parts. It's generally through our sponsor team and through the Economic Directorate, and they were very supportive of what we were doing. Because, as you rightly say, Convener, it's about ensuring value for the public pound.
Yeah. And Sandra Dunbar, you wanted to come in?
We didn't have any specific advice from the Scottish Government legal team. But again, perhaps just to say, as part of our wider openness and transparency, we consulted considerably around what we were doing with the operating company and the restoration of the funicular through the 2018 to 2022 period. So that did include also articulating within the Scottish Government how the legal cases were factoring into our decision making and our business case. But we didn't assume any recovery as part of our business case. We did take a conservative approach, but all of our considerations did ensure that we protected our position.
Good, I think that clarification has been helpful. I'm now going to turn to Graham Simpson, who's got some questions on the subject of financial management. Graham.
Yeah, thanks a lot for being here. I'll assume you can hear me. Yeah, I'm going to ask about finances, but my interest has been piqued by news that you want to open a toboggan. Can you tell me a bit about that? Because that might attract me up there.
If it's okay, Convener, I might ask Mike to comment on that one. Thanks.
Absolutely.
Certainly, yeah, the toboggan would be a great project for the area. There's been one that's gone in here recently, yes, which has been hugely successful. It will be a single track toboggan that can be fully accessible, so young people, people with disabilities will be able to use it, which is really encouraging. What we found as well, though, is that Cairngorm, a lot of the tourists who come aren't top-end mountain bikers or top-end skiers, and they want activities they can just kind of jump on and have a go. So, yeah, it's something we're very excited about. We have some designers coming in 2 weeks' time to have a look at it, and obviously once we get those designs, we'll happily share those.
And how long would the track be, and where would it be? Would it be accessed from the top of the mountain? Or?
So at the moment, it'll be accessed from the bottom. It'll have its own uplift. So once you get into the cart, it takes you up on the track. We hope we could put the longest one in the UK in. That's the plan. But what we need to do is work with the designers to ensure that the ground that we have will work for that. And we need to be sensitive with other users on the mountain as well.
Well, I have to say that sounds very exciting. So
you're welcome to come up with
maybe there'll be another committee visit. I'll certainly sign up for that. But I do need to ask about the finances. I suppose my sort of general question would be: has the funicular ever made money? Has it ever made a profit, or has it always been a loss situation?
I'll start, Convener, and I'll bring Sandra in again. There were periods in the early to mid sort of 2010s, I think, around that period, Sandra, when there was some profit made. It was relatively modest. I think at best around £400,000 to £500,000 a year. But it needs, at that point, it really needed good skiing weather. It was very dependent on the snow. And that's what we're trying to move away from, to give it much more year-round appeal and less dependence. And the double challenge with that, Convener, is that the snow is coming later and later. So it used to be that there was snow around about Christmas time and it would last through to beyond Easter. Now what's tending to happen with climate change and weather, it's coming in mid-February and it's then going to March. Now that actually poses a challenge for Highlands and Islands Enterprise in our budgeting, because we have to now allow for a fund of some size. We have to ask the company to predict that, and we have to take a judgment. So that's why it features so highly on our risk register. Now, up until 2023, we had some cover from Scottish Government, so if it went above a certain level, we always got support. We're now being asked to deal with that ourselves as a relatively small organisation, so it does create some financial challenges for us. But it did make some money around that period, around the 2010, 2014. Sandra?
I can be more specific if that helps the committee. Between the period 2008 to 2014, there were 4 out of the 7 years that the company actually made a profit. And I think that the work we're doing, and I think largely those profits were in periods and years where there was good snow cover, and the work that we're undertaking with CMSL to ensure that there's a diversified product offering, not the reliance just on snow sports, but the all-year-round attraction and more resilience, as well as the cost reduction measures. Mean that I think we're more comfortable that there'll be a sustainable business model going forward.
Okay. So it's fair to say that for the vast majority of the time that it's been in existence, it's made a loss. Have you managed to sort of tot up what the loss is over the years?
We would need to go back and look at all the accounts. It was run by a charitable local trust for some time, and that then didn't work, and that's why HIE stepped in an earlier period. So it has been problematic, but I think it's been far too dependent on winter sports. That's been the challenge, and that's what we're trying to move away from. And every resort in Europe is having to move away from just being reliant on winter snow. There's very few resorts that aren't doing that. I might ask Sandra to come in again.
Yeah, and perhaps just to clarify the period I referenced there in terms of the profitability from 2008. 2008 was when High took ownership of the operating company. We didn't. It wasn't a subsidiary of High prior to that period, and we helped restore the balance sheet, consider issues of debt, etc. So from that period, there was not an insignificant number of years where there was profitability. And I think our business case between 2018 and 20, where we developed the business case, did look at visitor numbers, sensitivities, diversification, and I think we feel there's a credible plan there for sustainability with the diversification and all year-round weather facilities that the operating company are working on.
But it's open at the moment. You've got some planned closures, but it's running at the moment. Is it making a profit now?
I'll ask Mike to come in, actually. He's got the most up-to-date figures.
Okay.
You don't need to press your button.
Oh, yeah, that's what I said. So this financial year we've taken in £1.8 million, which has pretty much covered the operational costs of Cairngorm Mountain. Which has been great. It shows there's a real appetite for what we're doing up at the mountain. It's been great. We've had over 70,000 visitors through the funicular itself, with another 30,000 visitors through kind of snow sports and the adventure sports this year. And going forward, we really want to kind of increase that, and the toboggan run would really help. We're looking at potentially having mountain bike tracks from the top. And also we need to look at opening at the top of the mountain for access for walkers from the funicular to the summit. Obviously, currently there's a visitor management plan in place, so we need to work with partners and do that in a very sensitive manner. But certainly that would, if you look at the figures of how many people come to Cairngorm and having more area to go walking, it's exceptionally high. So I think if we can offer that, but there are going to be challenges with that, and we need to look at the Section 50 agreement.
So currently it's kind of break even.
Currently we're at break even, but with a lot more to do. I've got lots of ideas, and the team are all on board. So yeah, we're looking forward to getting to that point.
Sounds like it. I mean, what would you say were the main factors that have contributed to the cost overruns over the piece, apart from snow?
I'll bring Sandra in. So, are you referring here to day-to-day operations, or
yeah? I mean, we could deal with breakdowns as well.
So the cost of remediation, the initial cost, did come in higher than the initial estimates, and that was related to a number of factors, including Brexit, the pandemic, and the situation in Ukraine as well. So there's been a range of different factors that affected the construction market that also affected Cairngorm. I think in terms of operations, we've talked about some of the issues, over-dependence on snow. I think the fact that you can't get out of the top station does put off a number of visitors. Mike's done some work on that, and we've got some evidence that people are, when they find out they can't leave the top station, they're turned away. And then we don't know about people who don't come because they know they can't get out the top. So there are factors there. But I think an important point for the committee is that the current work on the mountain is being done at Balfour Beatty's expense. We have some project management costs, but the current remediation and repair work is being paid for by the contractor. We've paid £70,000 towards them, towards their work. That's the sum. So they've been on the hill doing the work, and it's a very challenging site, 2 kilometres long, high mountain environment. Mm. But the current work that's underway is being paid for by Balfour Beatty.
Can you just explain that bit you said about not being able to get out at the top? I mean, you'll get the funicular up to a point. Yep. There's a restaurant. What do you mean you can't get out?
There's a visitor management plan that's been in place since the opening of the funicular, which restricts access, and it was done to protect the high mountain area. There was a concern that people would get up to the top of the funicular and then go out onto the high plateau, which is where the protected species are. You're obviously allowed out in winter for skiing, but summer visitors are not allowed out. You can walk to the top and get the funicular down, but you can't do the opposite. So that's something that's been in place as part of the planning agreement when the funicular was granted planning permission, and it was also a condition of the European funding. So that is the type of constraint that the funicular has been operating on since day one.
That sounds bizarre. You can walk to the top and get the funicular down, but you can't do it in reverse. It
was a planning condition put in place at the time, but we are working with Highland Council, with Nature Scot, and trying to do something about that.
So I'll jump on that.
Yeah.
We're currently investing in some technology to do a case study, and what we're going to do is give people devices that go in their pocket, and we can watch them going from the top station up to the summit and back down, hopefully using the paths that are in place. If we can make that case, and that's people aren't disappearing off the plateau, then I think we could get to a position where we can start opening up the top of the mountain. That's certainly the position I would like to get to, and we're going to work with Nature Scot and the Cairngorm National Park Authority on trying to make that happen.
And you need to do something about the planning permission, the conditions around that?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. There's a very odd situation, I've got to say. I think you need to tackle that. So just looking ahead, I mean, what safeguards have you got in place to prevent future structural failures and ensure reliability, really?
So the works that are ongoing at the moment and almost complete, we will have guarantees from the construction company around those, and we've also got collateral warranties. So there's a number of different things in place to make sure. The aim of the work is to bring the structure back to its life, its full life expectancy, which when it opened was 50 years. So it should be operational well into the middle of this century. That's the aim of the work. I might ask Sandra to come in on additional information.
Yeah, so I think the two things are as you said, the contractual provisions that give us some protections, but I think also the work that the operating company themselves would do in terms of the ongoing monitoring. which we have exceedingly experienced staff on the hill as well, which I think is a really important part of the information here, and perhaps Mike and Tim might want to comment, but I think that's our biggest strength in terms of the future resilience of the facility.
Yeah, I think we've reached a point now where we've remediated the structure. It's returned it to the standards required by the Department of Transport for their authorisation. So it's an authorised structure. We've got a maintenance and inspection regime now to ensure that all the critical components within that system are kept within that original specification. So we've got an ongoing maintenance process. Regular inspections to ensure that the sort of things that happened in the past can't happen again. And we've got an integrated sort of safety management system that is used to manage that. So we've got that gives us the safety assurance, if you like, that the funicular can be maintained safely in the future and exercise that 30-year life. So we're in a good position.
Okay. Can I just finally ask about the restaurant? Because obviously, presumably the restaurant isn't open if the funicular isn't open. So that must have caused real issues with that side of the business. Do you deal with that as a separate part of the business? Or, I mean, how's it been doing over the years? And how's it doing now?
So right now the restaurant's been doing very well indeed. They've been absolutely full for the last couple of months. The summer period, that's been at capacity pretty much. Certainly if the funicular isn't running, then you can't get access to the cafe. So the top cafe was closed, and all the food and beverage offerings were down at the bottom, where we had the biking and the karting and the adventure playground. So we still operated, but we weren't operating the whole mountain.
Okay.
I think it's important, Commissioner, just to say that also, although the funicular wasn't operating, there was some skiing during the winters when the funicular wasn't there. People were walking up to the mid-station and getting tows from there, or when there was good snow conditions, there was also the ability to get to the top without the funicular. There's also a very important piece of new infrastructure that was put in, was a couple of travelators, magic carpets, for a beginner's area and a snowmaking machine. And that proved extremely important for local ski schools who were able to keep operating. So the company, to its credit, did its best to try and get the resort open and operating in the absence of the funicular. But there's no question they were doing that with one hand tied behind their back, and it's in a much better position now.
Well, magic carpets, convener, that's something else to check out.
Yeah, okay. And I think you are really proving why it would be useful for us to be able to visualise the site and the different component parts of it. But can I just take you back to the financial management element around the reinstatement of the funicular? So in 2020, Audit Scotland produced a report, a Section 23 performance report, where it cited, I think, a figure from a meeting in February 2020, where the board considered the cost of basically tearing up the funicular would be £13.3 million to remove it. And the cost of reinstatement at that time was estimated to be 10 to 15 million pounds. That was February 2020, which of course we all recognise as the date at which the pandemic set in, and the world changed quite a lot after that. But if I can move us forward to the note that you've supplied to the committee very helpfully, you cite a figure of the reinstatement costs of 20.5 million, and I've also seen a figure reopened January 2023 with a cost attached, capital cost attached at that time at 25.4 million. I mean, can you talk us through that? I mean, you said it's costing us £70,000 to, and the contractor Balfour Beatty are paying for all. I mean, in fact, who has had to bear the burden of that inflation of costs? Is it high? Is it the subsidiary? Is it the constructor? Is it the Scottish Government?
Yes, thanks. Just to clarify, the reinstatement cost was £25 million.
Yeah.
So that's the correct figure. Yes, as you mentioned, there was a range of factors that happened after February 2020 that had huge impact on not just well, a huge impact worldwide, obviously, and that did affect the cost of the reinstatement. Also, when initial work started to be done on the structure, more issues were found with it, and that again was part of the subject of the legal issues that we won the settlement on. So there was more work than was first envisaged. I think in terms of the reinstatement costs at 25 million, subsequent to that, the work that's been done by Balfour Beatty, they have been bearing the cost of that, so that hasn't been paid for by HIE. We have paid £70,000 towards costs that Balfour Beatty incurred, but they've been paying for that. Of the reinstatement costs, the 25 million, 18 million of that was paid to Balfour Beatty, and the remainder was costs for consultancy and our teams that were supporting that work. So there's 18 million of the 25 paid to Balfour Beatty.
But again, just for the avoidance of doubt, Mr. Black, that's public money which is being applied.
That's correct.
Yeah.
It's public money. Yeah.
That's fine. That's fine. OK, I'm going to bring in Colin Beattie next. Colin.
Thank you, Convener. Correct me if I get my figures wrong here, but I understand the last time that the funicular made a profit was 10 years ago, broadly. Since then, most of the time, the funicular has been closed. How do you calculate? You earlier said that the GVA was 3.8 million from the funicular. How do you calculate that when it's been closed for such a long time?
Well, we've had periods when the funicular has been operating, and we've used the average number of visitors that have come and used the funicular whilst it's been operating. So there have been some periods of that time when it's been running. Obviously not the most recent periods, but as Mike said, we've had 70,000 visitors this year. Actually, the visitor numbers are slightly ahead of the business plan that we put together, the financial case. They're ahead in every aspect other than winter visitors, and I think that reflects the challenge around the climate. But the calculation is done on the basis of an estimate of around 11,000 visitors a month when the funicular has been running, an average. 11,000 a month. Now, we know that 60% of the visitors are day visitors and 40% are overnight visitors. And we apply spending figures to the day visitors and spending figures to the night visitors, overnight visitors, and then we take a view on the proportion of those people who have been coming precisely because of the funicular. We've taken quite a conservative view on overnight stays, and we multiply that, and that's where we come up with the spend figure, the £10 million a year. And I think that's important because although we've said that it hasn't been profitable, it's had a huge impact on the local economy, a very significant impact from that visitor spend.
I can understand the extrapolation you've done, but clearly the funicular has not been giving GVA 3.8 million consistently or even partially over most of the last almost 10 years. So it's a little bit of a finger in the wind, so to speak.
Well, we have used the numbers from when it was running. I appreciate it hasn't been running, and in fact, what Mike's saying around the 70,000 visitors, if that's extrapolated, then you're getting more than 10,000 visitors a month, more than 11,000. So, yeah, we're using a metric. We're taking some averages and multiplying it. But you're right, it hasn't been running for the last few years, so we're using previous figures.
And there isn't the benefit to the local economy from the funicular that you would hope for. You also stated there was 123 staff. Is that purely for the funicular?
Sorry, that's the 123 staff relates to the visitor spend. So there's around 100 staff in the resort, in the mountain resort. Mike will tell you the precise numbers working on the funicular, but I think the important thing about the funicular, it's not just that the funicular operation, it's also that you've got the restaurant at the top and all the staff there as well, so there is a big knock-on.
Yeah, I think what I'm trying to get at is you've calculated the GVA for the funicular, then you gave an injection into the local economy, so you said a 1.8 million in wages for 123 staff. Are we talking about the same thing?
No, sorry, Mr. Beattie, there's two different things. So one is the direct impact of the employment in Cairngorm Mountain, and that's where you have broadly 100 staff and 1.8 million of wages. The secondary effects are the effects of the spending on the local economy, and that's where we're talking about a spend of about 10 million and 123 jobs relating to that spend. So I'm not talking about, we're slightly mixing up the direct employment and direct spend on wages with the indirect spend in the local economy.
How many staff work for the funicular?
So on the hill during the summer we have around 63 staff. That's to run everything from the funicular to the 2 cafes and all the adventure sports. During the winter that can go up to just over 100. That's if we have a busy season. Obviously if we don't, then we don't have that many staff in. So it's quite a big range.
Now, during the period the funicular was closed, were you still paying any of these workers?
Well, the mountain resort has a certain staffing requirement. Obviously, when the funicular is up and running and there's more work at the top station and there's more activity on the slopes, then there's more staff. But I think generally there was around 60 to 65 staff employed.
And they were paid through the whole period that the funicular was closed?
Well, yes, because we were trying to one of the things we were trying to do is maintain the company and maintain the employment in the company. So there's more. I mean, it is tricky because obviously there's more economic impact and more benefit when the funicular's operating. But without the funicular operating, there was still things for people to do. There was upgrades, there was car park improvements, a whole range of different activities ongoing to try and bring in more revenue to the company. So we generally stayed around that, and Tim you might want to come in as well because he was on the board, but we generally stayed around that 60 to 65 employee level.
Okay.
So when the funicular wasn't working, we were still operating. The mountain biking, karting was still going on. The F&B at the lower car park was still open. So the resort was still running, but it just wasn't running at its normal capacity.
During the COVID period, the close-down periods, there were 26 staff put in furlough as well. So not all of the staff were working during the COVID closures. And of course, there were 2 COVID closures in 2020 and 2021.
Is it easy to get seasonal staff?
Again, I'll defer to Mike, but I think there have been challenges post Brexit, as you know, and it's affected lots of parts of Scotland. It's particularly affected tourism-dependent areas. But I'll let Mike talk about the recruitment issues.
Yeah, it certainly can be challenging, certainly within the outdoor sector, and obviously food and beverage sector is a difficult one. Currently, we're up fully staffed, and we have seasonal staff who've been on board, who've asked to stay for the winter season as well. So currently, Cairngorm is actually in a very, very good position.
Now, obviously, I would hope you'd be embedded in the local community. How do you engage with and respond to community concerns, and especially during the rather more sensitive periods that you're actually closed?
I think, well, Mike knows, but there's a huge amount of interest in what's happening at the funicular, and there's lots of local interest in what's going on in the mountain. As you drive out of Aviemore, there's a sign every day that tells you when the funicular is open, and it has a big impact on the local community. Responding to concerns, I think that Elaine talked about the Cairngorm Advisory Group, and we use that mechanism. It met much more frequently in the past. It meets now a couple of times a year, but I think that's because we've gained more confidence from the community. We do work closely with the Aviemore and Glenmore Community Development Trust, and they're a very active organisation in the local area, and HIE works with them on a range of different things. So I would say the communication isn't just through what's happening on the hill, it's through our wider integration with activity in the local area. And we've continued to work with lots of other businesses, so we know that other tourism businesses, we know the impact that the funicular being closed has on them, but we've been very embedded both in the community organisations and in the small businesses in that area. So we're quite aware of what's happening.
I mean, is there a formal process for, communicating with the community other than, ad hoc organisations?
Well, there's lots of information on the Cairngorm Mountain website. Every day they're updating about what's happening. we also have information on our website. And as I say, we have the formal Cairngorm Advisory Group, which used to meet much more often. So I think we're quite clear on what's happening. And if people want to raise issues with us, they either raise them directly with the Cairngorm team, Cairngorm Mountain team, or they can raise them with ourselves.
You say you have an advisory group. Who's on that advisory group?
Well, it's chaired by the Highland Council convener, who's also a board member of Cairngorm Mountain. I'll maybe get Elaine to talk about that.
Excuse me, there's quite a wide range of membership actually, so it includes local community interest, local business interest, other public sector stakeholders who have got an interest in outdoor or sports activities. We've got neighbouring landowners. Let me quickly remind myself. Another mountain sport organisation. So the membership is over 20. Not everybody comes to every meeting, but when we do share information, when we've got something to say, we make sure that all members of the CAG get that information in advance, and we give them the opportunity to come back and speak to us, or if there's anything they want to raise with us, then they can do that. So yeah, we've tried to be as open and to include as many of those people or organisations locally and actually sporting nationally who have got an interest in Cairngorm. That also includes the Section 50 stakeholders who are involved with the visitor management plan we talked about earlier, so the likes of Nature Scott, Highland Council and others as well.
Remind
and of course
me how
the
often
Park
that
Authority.
group meets?
At one point it was very regular. When it started off it was called the Funicular Response Group, and that was set up obviously in response to the problem we had. At that point it met 6 weekly, 8 weekly. It then went to quarterly as it evolved into the Cairngorm Advisory Group, and now it's down to, in the last year or so, it's been down to twice a year. But there's lots of touch points in between that as well. Our area team are very active in working with businesses and communities in the Badenoch and Strathspey area. So that's not the only time we speak to these stakeholders. There's lots of other opportunities and forums and meetings at which many of the same people are at. So I would say there's a really good relationship now with local stakeholders, local businesses, local communities, and a real feeling, I would hope, that High is an open door and they can speak to us and they can speak to Mike's team on any issues that they feel are arising.
Just one last question. How do you measure the long-term economic impact of the funicular and its associated businesses?
There are at various times there are studies undertaken on the ski sector in Scotland. For example, the figures that we were using were based on a 2022 study. So there are studies like that done from time to time. We can do our own evaluation work. We do get a lot of positive feedback from the local community and local businesses, and indeed we'll make sure that you get to meet these people and meet some people from the CAG. So, but I think in terms of the long-term economic impact, we've done a lot of modelling on this. So the business case looked at what the economic impact would be, and in fact, even at the higher cost of reinstatement, the benefit is still very, very positive. It's more than 3 to 1 in terms of the business case. And we know that the economic impact on an ongoing basis is very significant. But we could do an evaluation study once it's been up and running for a period. We could do a more detailed study.
Thank you, Mayor.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm now going to invite the Deputy Convener, Jamie Green, to put some questions to you. Jamie.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. Let me bring you back to some financial questions. Mr Black, you stated, I think, 3 times over the course of this morning, and it's also in your written submission, you're very keen to stress that Balfour Beatty have absorbed the cost of the remediation on the funicular. I presume Balfour Beatty hasn't sprouted a charitable arm. In what circumstances are they undertaking that work? Presumably they were paid to do it. That's why you're telling us that.
Well, they were paid to do the reinstatement work, and subsequent inspections on the structure have found issues, and those issues we've sought to have put right, and the contractor is doing that work. I think you can draw your own conclusion from that.
Okay. So, I mean, they were paid to do a job and they're doing the job, but who paid for it? Where did the £18 million come from?
No, well, the reinstatement work, I've already said, was paid for by the public sector. A combination of HIE and Scottish Government paid for that work. But the subsequent work, the remediation that's ongoing at the moment, that is being paid for by Balfour Beatty.
Okay, so anything over 18 million they will cover the cost of, is that correct?
we're possibly getting into contractual matters, convener.
Well, it's important. It's public money. So.
Well, at the current time, we have paid Balfour Beatty for the work that was started following the closure in 2023. That work, we've paid Balfour Beatty £70,000 to date.
Yeah, you get to the crux of my question, though. I mean, you've obviously there's a huge chunk of public money that's been paid to a private contractor to deliver the project and get it up to speed. There's still some work clearly going on, although you say it's minor rather than substantive. My point being is, as the Public Audit Committee, we're trying to work out what the potential liability to the public purse is overall.
Well, we have, in terms of the remediation work, we have paid £2 million to contractors working on our behalf, to our project managers, for legal support, that type of thing. But the sum to the contractor, the main contractor, is £70,000.
Okay.
So the work that they're doing is being done at their cost to put right work that was not done correctly in the first point.
See. Okay, that makes a little bit more sense. Okay, thank you. I won't press that matter. You also said something interesting in response to other questions about HIE's risk factor and how you budget for this planning ahead. You said, I believe, that the Scottish Government had provided some cover. I presume you mean financial cover, so the question would be how much? In other words, at what level would your subsidy levels run out and you would need to draw down from Scottish Government money? And you also, I believe, said that has been removed. So my question, logically, off the back of that is, what happens when the operating company asks for more money than you have budgeted for?
Well, we would then have to get into a discussion with our sponsor team and the Scottish Government about how we could support that. But at the moment, we have a budget allowance for Cairngorm Mountain within our budget as a subsidiary. And if they were to exceed that, we would have to have discussions with our sponsor team. We may have to find the money from other parts of our budget, or we may be allowed an authorised overspend. That would be the two mechanisms. Okay, that answers that question. Thank you. My other question is more of a general one, and it's maybe an observation that you can respond to, and that's my understanding is that HIE took over the funicular in 2018 using the subsidiary that is here today, yet it only really fully went into operation in 2015, so 7 years passed, and appreciate the COVID years were in the middle of that, and life was difficult for everyone. But nonetheless, construction was still taking place during the COVID years, my understanding is, in many sectors. So I guess my overall question is, why did it take 7 years to get it up and running? I'd find it hard to believe in any other snow-based resort in Europe that they would have put up with 7 years of non-activity. I think the challenge of the site, when you see it, you'll start to understand the difficulty that the construction entailed. We're talking about very steep gradients, very high mountain environment. A lot of the work required temperatures of +5 centigrade for prolonged periods, and you just don't get that for many of the winter months in particular over that period. So it was a very challenging period. It did operate for a 6-month period within that window you mentioned between 2018 and 2025, so there was a period of operation. But I think the challenging environment, the other factors mentioned around Brexit, the cost inflation in the construction sector, and also labour supply was a big issue as well. So there's a range of different factors. But I think when you see the construction site, it's 1.8 kilometres. It's going up almost 4,000 feet up into the Cairngorm Mountains. It is a very, very difficult environment, and I think the contractor has to also get some credit for the work that was done as well. It has been a very difficult job for them. I appreciate that.
Yeah. At the end of 2018, the funicular came out of operation. We then spent a period looking at whether, one, it could be actually reinstated at all. Secondly, what that design, design might look like. But also at the same time, we looked at actually was reinstatement the best option, or would it be better to remove it or to replace it with something else? So we did go through a business case process from later in 2019, which concluded in August 2020. We then entered into contract with Balfour Beatty in the October 2020, and then they started work in the November. So they've got a very short few weeks in 2020 before they had to demobilise for the winter period. Because you'll appreciate in the mountain environment, a construction period is actually really very short. So they demobilised over that first winter and then came back onto site in the April 21. So it wasn't actually 7 years of construction. It was a shorter period of construction. The reinstatement took 2 seasons to complete, and that, as I've said, is because it is such a difficult environment to work in. So you can only work during really the better months of the year.
Yeah, and I do appreciate that. And thank you for the additional information. But based on that, therefore, may I ask, given a previous question by the convener, that if it was established that the cost to start afresh and rebuild or build new, as opposed to try and remediate what was there, it sounds to me like it's costing about double to do the remediation it would have cost to just simply put a new funicular in. So who made that decision and why?
So we did a full business case which was scrutinised by both our board, and it also went to Scottish Government as well. So the numbers you'd mentioned earlier, around 13 million, they were actually revisited as part of the full business case. We looked at what the full cost, because if you take the funicular out, you also need to take infrastructure top and bottom of the mountain out as well, so that would have pushed the cost of removal up a bit as well. But the key thing there was if you remove the funicular, you pretty much close down the business and you lose all the benefit to the local economy. So when we looked at the impact of the different options, the best impact came with actually reinstatement as a kind of balance between cost of doing something and what you get out of it at the end. And we did actually test that again. So by summer 21, when it was clear that costs were increasing and that we couldn't conclude in one season, we had originally hoped that the works could conclude in one season. Because of the challenges that Stuart's talked about, that wasn't possible. So it was clear at that point that it was going to the right and the costs were going to go up. So we actually revisited that business case and we rerun all the numbers. So what we did was we looked at different scenarios for the reinstatement. So we based it on what we knew or what we understood the cost increase was at that time. But we also tested what the tipping point would be. So we ran the numbers with a £15 million overspend and a conclusion of works in 25-26. And even at that level, that didn't tip the balance. It's still reinstatement still came out as the best option. And we tried to be really conservative when we did that. So although we added additional costs to reinstatement and we added additional time, we didn't make any changes to the other options we'd looked at, despite the fact they would inevitably have gone up as well, sheer price inflation if nothing else. So we did try and take a pretty stringent approach to that. There wasn't an assumption at the start that reinstatement was the best option. It was what is the right thing to do for the local economy. And that's where we ended where we did.
Okay, that sounds like an interesting process of due diligence that you undertook. What's the current shelf life of the funicular once it's fully remediated, if you like? When we have to start thinking about replacement? Well,
the remediation and reinstatement works take it back to its original design life, so it's 50 years from 2021. Okay. So, but with good maintenance, structures will last longer, so we do know that. And that's why the maintenance schedules and work that CMSL will do and have got very clear processes and procedures around will enable that.
Thank you. Mr Gifford, let's talk about some of the positives looking ahead, although I appreciate we do have a job to do as well looking backwards. But clearly the issues that you're facing, Cairngorm, are being shared right across Europe. I'm sure you speak to resorts in the Pyrenees or the Spanish Sierra Nevada that have suffered the same shrinkage of its resort period, increased climate challenges. The average temperature in parts of Andorra was 23 degrees last January, for example. I mean, that's incredibly difficult for a ski resort for obvious reasons. So how are you looking to underpin the resort as having a long-term future? What are you doing to diversify meaningfully to bring revenue in and people up there?
Firstly, I think I've been in the ski industry for about 25, 30 years now. And back in 30 years ago, we were discussing there's going to be no snow in 5 years' time. And it does come in cycles. One of the best seasons we had in a long time is in 2020. So not that long ago. So we are due another one. But certainly it's going forward, we need to diversify, as you said. We've already done, or the team has made improvements on the slope for mountain biking, bench play areas. We've put in a camper van parking area. But what I want to do going forward is to enhance all those, make sure they're all running well. We can do better on our camper van parking area by inviting touring vans in, putting better facilities in, which we don't currently have. The toboggan run will certainly help. That's something that if that goes in, that can run all year round. I believe the one here in Edinburgh ran throughout the winter and was fully booked. And if you go on their website just now, it says there is no walk-ins at all. You must pre-book. So what we want to do is make sure that the activities we've got are year-round, so that it doesn't matter whether we've got snow on the ground or not. The other thing we can do is start looking at ski touring. So Cairngorm Mountain is the one centre in Scotland that we can get people very high on the funicular without requiring snow on the ground, down at lower levels, because you don't need the drag uplifts. So we can get people higher when the other resorts can't, and potentially we can allow people to go ski touring, depending on the Section 50 agreement around the planning. So we need to look at that quite carefully. But certainly, I think Cairngorm has a very positive future as a year-round destination.
I can certainly attest to, over the last few years, turning up in my Mazda Bongo to find that there's nowhere to park it, and due to weather, that the skiing was off. So after a very long drive up there, we just drove back home again. Yeah. So I guess that's probably an experience that many people have faced, particularly in the domestic market. And if you've done that 2 or 3 times and you've made the effort to go up there in the morning when the weather's posted as being okay and it takes a turn and the cafe shuts really early, which it did when I turned up, there's just nothing else to do. So we all left. How do you convince people like that to come back?
So certainly, if that happened when we've got the toboggan run, you will have something to do. Certainly, I'm looking at the way the whole business operates. If customers are still coming up, cafes will be open. Right. We're also looking at, I think it's really important to start blurring seasons now. We don't have a start and a stop. It's not summer season now, winter season. We blur those seasons, and we're ready. If there's not snow on the ground, we will be karting and we will be mountain biking. You can use the toboggan run. So yeah, we just need to be a lot more flexible, and yeah.
Okay. Can I ask if you offer local residents any discounts, and what are they? Yeah,
so we certainly do. So the car parking area, for example, there's a season pass for residents, which is £20. We're also there is a season pass for skiers. Now, what we've done is we've kept that price the same as last year. But we've also, for local residents, we've added in all sorts of other things so they can use that year-round. They can come up the funicular year-round for free. They can access the mountain biking trails as well. Currently, for residents who aren't season pass holders, they can come and ride at the trails every Friday for free. Okay. And again, this is through feedback. I've been engaging with the community quite a lot. Community engagement is really important to me, and we will be looking at ways we can support them.
That's feel free.
So yeah, we've got the schools. So the Badenoch Strathspey Ski School Association. So we have 300 pupils coming through that every year. We do not charge those schools for access to the mountain at all, so they can come for free. It's very popular, but again, vitally important to what we're doing.
That's very helpful, and that's good to hear. And hopefully word of mouth will help propagate traffic. Can I just ask one final question? That's more about the long-term vision. This is maybe a joint question for yourself and HIE. The investment at the moment is very much a piecemeal. It has been for obvious reasons due to the remediation and adding on bits to the resort to improve it. Car parking, you mentioned, the potential for toboggan and other improvements that you're doing, but it doesn't sound to me like a long-term strategy with a big ticket ask at the top of it. Can I ask, what is the long-term plan? What sort of numbers are you looking at here in terms of long-term investment to ensure that 20, 30 years down the line that there still is a buoyant resort that's self-sufficient and popular and busy?
We have actually been working to a strategy. There is a strategy in place which was jointly agreed between ourselves, and the national parks also signed up to that strategy. So although it may seem piecemeal to you, there's actually a clear strategy that's been set in place. It's due for review next year. It's a 5-year strategy. I mean, Mike's vision is to have this as the UK's premier mountain resort. That's one that we share. I think in terms of looking ahead, there are some quite big decisions to be taken. The Day Lodge building, which you'll see dates from the 1980s. It's not very energy efficient. It's poorly laid out. It's not disabled friendly. There's a range of different things there. That's a big question. The other question is further uplift, potentially another chairlift facility on the mountain. So these are two big ticket items which need to be addressed, and they're beyond Highlands and Islands Enterprise budget. But this is, I would argue, a national resource. It's the only mountain railway in Scotland, and it's a very important mountain, the sixth highest in Scotland, in the middle of a national park. So it's a key tourism asset for the country, and that's why I think it needs attention. I'll let Mike talk to what his vision is.
Yeah. So as Stuart mentioned, we want to be fully sustainable, a year-round mountain resort. We want to be the best in the UK. I think the current plan, the 25-year plan, is up for review next year. Obviously, that's going to be very useful for myself because I'm just coming into it, so I can add my views. We also need to get a year under our belt and look at how the figures are and to see how Cairngorm's performing. That community engagement, I think, is going to be really important to also shaping the future of where Cairngorm goes. They need to be part of that. Cairngorm is hugely important, not just to ski schools, but it's also mountaineering instructors, environmental groups. There's a national training centre that use us every day. Yeah, it's hugely important to the local area, and that all needs to help shape the vision. I've been in 3 months. I'm working on a 3-year plan, and we'll continue to look further beyond that.
Presumably, you'll be knocking on the doors of ministers next year, whoever the government is.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, thanks very much indeed. In fact, we're very conscious that I think you're going to the Economy Committee for their pre-budget scrutiny session, so we've been conscious of the time that we've got with you this morning. But can I take this opportunity to thank all of you, Tim Hurst, Mike Gifford, Sandra Dunbar, Elaine Hanton, and to you, Stuart Black, CEO of HIGH, for giving us your time this morning, cooperating with the questions that we've been putting to you. As I said at the start, it is a kind of mini inquiry for us as a Public Audit Committee to look into the detail of how the project has performed and what the future vision and strategy for it is. So can I thank you very much indeed for now, and we will see you again in the future, I'm sure, when the committee organises its visit to speak to the community and other stakeholders, as well as visiting the site in the coming weeks. I am now going to move the committee into suspension whilst we have a changeover of witnesses. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Good morning. Can I resume today's Public Audit Committee meeting by welcoming our guests to discuss the recently produced report by Audit Scotland and the Accounts Commission into flooding in communities moving towards resilience. I'm very pleased that we're joined this morning by the Auditor General, Stephen Boyle. Good morning. And alongside the Auditor General is Rebecca Seidel, who is a Senior Manager at Audit Scotland, and by Fiona Brannigan, who is an Audit Manager at Audit Scotland. And I'm also very pleased to welcome Andrew Burns, who's the Deputy Chair of the Accounts Commission. Good morning, Andrew. We've got some questions to put to you about the report. Before we get to those questions, Auditor General, could I invite you to make an opening statement?
Many thanks indeed, Convener. Good morning to the committee. I'm very pleased to present this joint report from the Accounts Commission and myself on flooding in communities. Flooding is a growing threat in Scotland, driven by climate change, and there are currently over 284,000 properties that are at risk. Projections indicate that this number will rise to 400,000 by the year 2080. Of course, the impacts of flooding are very serious. Damaged homes, financial strain, and effects on physical and mental health, notably for vulnerable groups in society. Flood resilience means not only protecting people from flooding, but helping them prepare and recover. It requires strong collaboration across public bodies, councils and communities. In our work, we saw good examples of joint working, but we also noted that progress is being held back at times, with unclear roles and responsibilities, data gaps and weak leadership arrangements. Community engagement also needs improvement. Major flood defence schemes are one part of the solution, but our audit found that costs have tripled from £350 million to over £1 billion, and fewer schemes are being delivered than were originally intended. We concluded that the current funding model is not fit for purpose and doesn't adequately manage risks or delays, and future funding remains uncertain. Our report makes recommendations to the Scottish Government and COSLA to agree a more robust funding approach. The National Flood Resilience Strategy that was published in December 2024 is a welcome shift, Convener, to a broader set of resilience arrangements. However, it lacks the detail needed to ensure timely and effective action. And we also make recommendations that the Scottish Government establish clear implementation arrangements for the National Flood Resilience Strategy over the next 12 months. As you know, Convener, delighted to be joined by Andrew Burns from the Accounts Commission, along with the two of the report authors, Rebecca Seidel and Fiona Brannigan, and as ever, we'll do our utmost to answer the committee's questions.
Thank you very much indeed. Can I begin really by asking you to elaborate a little bit about what is the direct but also the indirect impact on communities of flooding? And could you perhaps develop a little bit the argument which is in the report about the unequal effect of flooding on particular groups in society?
Yeah, very happy to do that, Convener, and I'll bring Fiona in. Actually, might want to kind of sit a bit more of the detail that sat behind our analysis. And as ever, if Andrew wants to come in, I'm sure he'll do so at any point over the course of the session. What might be helpful, Convener, is perhaps just to direct the committee to, firstly, to Exhibit 3 in today's report on page 14, which we set out some of the impact of flooding. And I won't go through all of those, but these are significant impacts on people's health, financial circumstances, not to mention the risk to people's physical safety in the event that a flooding event happens while people are living in the property. And our report, while just in terms of the parameters report, what we didn't do in the report was look to analyse individual flood protection schemes, or to go into the reasons why a flooding event has happened and been more severe in a particular community in Scotland. But we have included some case studies, I think most notably the case study in Brecon as a result of Storm Babet, and that's also on page 13. In terms of the unequal impact We talked, I think, at various points in the report, and we'll certainly bring to Fiona in a moment to elaborate, is that sense of the choices that are being made by public bodies. What's driving those choices in terms of the quality of community engagement? And we know that that needs to improve, but also that that can influence the decisions that are being made. And Fiona might want to touch on some of this as she develops my response, particularly about kind of which schemes are being prioritised and are they inadvertently being driven by factors that can cause inequality, such as higher property values might be seen as a driver for the need for more investment. So there's a range of factors, and we make associated recommendations, Convener, but principally for public bodies, as they're developing further approaches on the implementation, is that they draw more widely on the national standards for community engagement in place, and we set some of that out towards the end of the report. I'll pause, Convener. I think Fiona looked at this matter closely when we pulled together the report, so I'm keen to bring her in.
Thanks, Stephen. So I think in terms of the impacts, these have already been covered in the sense that it's really about the fact that this is so deep for people. It's within their homes quite often, and that can have a really undermining kind of quality then to people's lives moving forward, because the very place of security has been impacted in a way that then can leave people feeling anxious. And there may well be an exacerbation of long-term health conditions. There can be an exacerbation of mental health conditions, or kind of triggering new physical and mental health. And the trauma can last for many years, particularly when you take into account that a lot of people in communities, if it's been badly affected, could have to leave their homes for a long period of time, or they go back into their homes and there's still a lot of clear up to do. There could be damp and mould issues. So this really gets to the very heart of people's sense of security and their sense of community. You can see examples where communities start to break down because people leave, and other people might not want to move into those areas because of the flood risk. So it can have such a long-term impact, and then of course that has an impact more broadly in society, and potentially, as we've kind of stressed in the report, there's a risk of inequalities increasing. In terms of the vulnerability of some people and why some people are more vulnerable than others. So it's the vulnerability to the impacts and the differences in the ability to recover from a flood event. So if you don't have the financial resources, for example, if that's unequal, you might find it much more difficult in order to then progress forward. And there's always going to be expenditure that's not necessarily covered by insurance, for example. And of course, some people may not have been able to afford insurance in the first place, and therefore it's very, very impactful indeed. And then if you take into account older people can be much more vulnerable because of health conditions or general frailty. Young children can be more vulnerable. So there's a whole range of vulnerability that comes into play in terms of how they can progress forward. What our report finds is that there is not sufficient focus on those inequalities and vulnerabilities across a wide range of areas, although there are good examples, good areas of practice. In general, we didn't find that focus was there. And as has been pointed out by the Auditor General, the criteria used for actually determining flood schemes, it may well have had an unintended consequence of actually providing more protection for areas that are more affluent, because if that's used as your value for money criteria, the value of the properties, then of course you're going to have a kind of skew away from those areas that might have more residents, but actually the value of the property isn't as high. So in our report we make the recommendation that inequalities is more specific attention is focused on that in terms of the criteria for funding, but also in terms of that wider activity and how that community engagement and that kind of development of plans going forward takes inequalities into account more clearly.
That's very, very clear, and thank you for that. I mean, I suppose the corollary of that is what you are saying then, that there has been a skewing of prioritisation to schemes where higher value properties are at risk. Do you have evidence of that?
So this is an issue that was raised by stakeholders with us. They identified themselves that this could potentially have happened. We're not aware of any analysis that's actually looked at whether that has happened or not. We would expect one of our recommendations is around data gaps, and if public sector bodies feel that that is a particular data gap and actually it would help in the development of funding criteria, for example, we would expect them to prioritise that going forward over the next 6 months.
Thank you. I think Andrew Burns wanted to come in on this question too.
No, thanks very much, Convener. Maybe just to amplify, hopefully, helpfully, some of the points that Fiona and the Auditor General have made from the Commission's perspective. I mean, as one of the two sponsors of this piece of work for the Accounts Commission, I'm relieved to say that at a personal level, I've never been affected by a flooding incident, but I've learned really quickly through the course of this piece of work and the evidence that Rebecca and Fiona and other colleagues have collated, that in essence it's a really, really traumatic experience, regardless of economic position or status. It's a really traumatic experience, and anything that can be done to alleviate that trauma in terms of making the process of recovery as smooth as possible is to be promoted and encouraged. And I would just further amplify one point that the Auditor General made about the national standards for community engagement being really crucial. We ourselves, as Audit Scotland Auditor General and the Accounts Commission, I think it was back in 2019-2020, did produce a piece of work around principles for community empowerment, and we enshrined 5 principles. I'm looking at it in front of these on the screen just now. They're still valid. I would really encourage the committee, as well as the national standards, to look at that piece of work that we jointly produced back in 2019-2020, because they do highlight how important it is to involve communities right throughout the process to make recovery from the trauma as straightforward and as easy as possible.
But I suppose the question that's provoked by the evidence that Fiona Brannigan has given to us is which communities? And there are some communities that will be better organised, more articulate, better resourced, possibly with professional legal support than other communities. And the message I've got from the evidence we've taken so far is there needs to be an equalisation, and maybe the criteria that's applied needs to better reflect need rather than simply property values. Auditor General.
I think that's a fair assessment, Convener, and I'm sure the committee, to your own members, to your own constituency work, will have seen examples of where there are very significant flood prevention proposals, and these are emotive issues that for communities who are in favour and those that are against. And there are also, I think as the report touches on, and Fiona might want to say a bit more about this, some of the unintended consequences that a flood prevention scheme might offer safety to one part of the country, but then transfer risk to another part. So really the recommendation based on the work that we undertook is that there needs to be better clarity of roles and responsibilities, better signposting for people about, particularly to support the government's ambition to implement a strategy that moves away from the 2009 legislation of flood management arrangements to one of flood resilience. And if that is going to be about not just the role of public bodies, but also how individuals and groups in society can better prepare and recover, that's going to require real improvements in signposting, clarity, and really that equalisation, Convener, of people's voices all play an equal part.
I mean, you do say in paragraph 23 of the report, you make the point, so Parliament passed the Flood Risk Management Act in 2009, but what you say in the report is the Scottish Government did not introduce a way to monitor progress in addressing flooding in communities. So I suppose the outstanding question then is, has it introduced ways of monitoring progress in addressing flooding in communities in the context of the National Flood Resilience Strategy? Have lessons been learned? Do you get a sense that there is more of an oversight of a monitoring system in place to make sure the right decisions and the right priorities are being followed.
So I'll bring Rebecca in, who's looked at this part of the report, convener, in detail. I think you're right. What we've said is something of a theme in our reporting about the need for good data, not just in and of itself, but actually to support decision-making, evaluation, monitoring, and any changes that policymakers and implementers of those decisions choose to make. And we found that there was inconsistency, data gaps. The point you make, as we touched on in paragraph 23, that so while the legislation of the 2009 Act at a high level, it didn't include any objectives, indicators or measures to monitor progress towards the implementation of the Act, notwithstanding that elements of it do require periodic updates. I welcomed the National Flood Risk Management Strategy in my introductory remarks. I think it provides a recognition that the circumstances brought upon us by climate change mean that, candidly, it won't be possible to protect every community from the traumatic impact of flooding. But that has to be underpinned by good quality data, an implementation plan. And that's the point that I think kind of keen to bring Rebecca in, just to say a bit more about what needs to happen now beyond the welcome strategy in and of itself.
Thank you, Auditor General. In terms of the monitoring of flood defence arrangements across Scotland, we highlight in the report that there currently is no national monitoring of the condition of flood schemes, and so there's not really a full understanding of the level of protection that has currently been offered to communities across Scotland. And that links to our recommendation that the Auditor General has highlighted that within 6 months we want the government, councils, SEPA, Scottish Water to be working together to identify where some of those key gaps in information and data are, and within 12 months look to develop an action plan in terms of how they're going to address them. Linked to the publication of the new National Flood Resilience Strategy, the Scottish Government has provided some funding to SEPA in this current financial year to develop a database of over 200 flood and coastal defence systems that are currently in place in Scotland, and that's very much seen as a first step in starting to pull together information in that area to give a much better understanding of the assets that are located across Scotland and the level of protection that they offer and the condition of those flood defence schemes. More will need to be done on top of that, but we see that as a positive first step in starting to plug that data gap that currently exists.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to now invite Colin Beattie to pursue some of those strands around public sector collaboration. Colin.
Thank you, Mayor. Public sector collaboration. Page 19, paragraph 31 makes a statement that ambiguities, complexity and gaps in roles and responsibilities. That's a fairly sweeping statement. Can you give a bit more detail on the impact on communities of these ambiguities and gaps?
Yeah, good morning, Mr Beattie. I'm happy to start on that. I'll certainly bring others. I'm sure Andrew might want to come in and Fiona likewise. Perhaps just highlighting again one of the exhibits in the report on page 20, exhibit 6. I think, as Rebecca touches on, there are a number of organisations that have a role and responsibility in flood management and now flood resilience arrangements. 32 local authorities, public bodies in Scottish Water, SEPA. And the expectation of the 2009 legislation was that these bodies would work together. But what I think we've seen through our audit work, and particularly the engagement and feedback that we received from stakeholders, was that there was a lack of clarity at times for who was responsible for a particular part of how this system would operate. And at page 32 in the report, together with a short sidebar, we give the example of what's known as sustainable urban drainage system, or SUDS ponds, as sometimes referred, as an example of a lack of clarity about who is responsible for that. The role, for example, that waterway management issues was also cited. and a sense of where do people go to get the advice or information that they might need. And again, that coming back through the audit work is that the signposting is inconsistent. What you might get an answer in one part of Scotland that could be contradicted from another, or indeed from one public body within the same local authority area. So we are clear that in order for this system to work together, not just come back to the last legislation, but also the opportunity afforded by the new strategy, is that effective collaboration, and it will need to be done collaboratively given the overlapping responsibilities. After all, water doesn't respect public sector body boundaries, is that will need to be done more effectively with more clarity than is currently the case. But I'm keen to bring Fiona in first of all, and then Andrew.
Yeah, so the legislation took a proactive approach to flood management, so moving on from a more reactive approach where places have been flooded previously, then there may be the intention then to do something about that. With the Flood Risk Management Act, the idea was that the level of risk for the future was identified and then action was taken in order to address that future risk. But as with any legislation, not all of the roles and responsibilities are necessarily captured within that. And some of the particular gaps, as the Auditor General has pointed out, are around sustainable urban drainage schemes. And they're particularly significant because if a new housing development, for example, is developed where there's the potential for runoff to then cause a greater flood risk in an adjacent community, one of the interventions is to introduce SUDs, which then allows that water to be adequately absorbed by the land. However, if that's not maintained, the ability of the land to absorb that water is reduced. But there's no clarity around who actually is responsible for maintaining that SUD scheme in order to make sure that that intervention actually fulfills the purpose that it was designed to do. And that's an area that potentially requires more work, and there's an ambiguity around that. There's also difficulties in terms of there are responsibilities on individual property owners, but again, that's not set out clearly what those responsibilities are. So that can lead to a level of anxiety, a level of frustration among communities and individuals because they're not quite clear on what it is that they're supposed to be doing, and they could get different answers to that question from different sources. Also, there are sort of general requirements within the legislation around, for example, councils being responsible for clearing waterways. But what stakeholders have told us from their experience is that different council areas may actually interpret those requirements in different ways. And so actually communities in different areas are getting different levels of service from that. And then there are key areas where there are gaps, such as around coastal monitoring and coastal erosion, and no clear levels of roles and responsibilities set out in the same way that there are other roles and responsibilities set out within the legislation. And that's why, as the Auditor General has said, we have made the recommendation that there's a real collaboration around that to prioritise what are those major gaps in information and what are those major ambiguities, so that the sector as a whole can prioritise what action needs to be taken in order to address them. And we've put in clear timescales for that to happen.
You mentioned SUDs, and it's something I've never thought about. What maintenance do SUDs need?
I would depend upon the individual scheme, but I think in general terms, it would be if, for example, if there are areas to absorb that water and it becomes filled up with other things that prevent the water absorption happening in the way that it's intended. But it's not something that we are the experts on in terms of how the mechanics of that would work. But of course, the stakeholders who are more directly involved have told us that this is an issue in the sector.
General, in connection with these ambiguities and so on, do they have to be resolved at a governmental level? Do they have to be resolved by legislation? Or is it simply the different parties need to get together and work out between themselves what their parameters are?
Yeah, I think it's the latter, Mr. Beattie, that rather than new legislation, I think what we have now is a strategy from government that affords them the opportunity to implement successfully the legislation from 2009 that talks about the need for better collaboration, encompassing the ambition to move away from flood prevention, which I think is a shared consensus that with climate change 16 years after the legislation was acted, that is not going to be achieved by individual schemes, that requires a broader range of approaches. But underpinning that is the clarity around roles and responsibilities. A couple of examples we've touched on already this morning, but a clear implementation plan about what's going to happen and then how that's going to be monitored. I think Andrew might want to talk about this and the other point, but councils will have a fundamentally important role to ensuring that the ambitions of the strategy are realised.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Colin, for the question. I mean, on a general point of collaboration and communication, at a local level, it's absolutely fundamental to get that right. And I know you asked about how that impacts when it goes wrong. I mean, I would just draw the committee's attention, maybe posit the converse. There's a supplement to the report that has about 10, I think, case studies or case examples of things that have gone well. And I'll draw committee's attention in particular to case study 3, the Dumfries and Galloway flood resilience activity. I mean, it sounds so simple, but they employ 12 local ward officers at a ward level who act as the liaison between the local community and the myriad other organisations that have to have a positive impact once a flooding event occurs, whether it's SEPA, whether it's the government, whether it's funding streams. And they basically act as brokers between the local community and all these other organisations. And we highlight it in the supplement as one example of really good practice. And you just reverse that. When that doesn't exist, you can see the barriers that Stephen and others have already referred to that are thrown up for local communities to be able to access quickly, which is really crucial once a flooding event has happened. And as colleagues have already said, they are going to happen, unfortunately, in the future more frequently. It allows local communities to access help and support quickly and swiftly and smoothly without such a sort of ward officer arrangement. As one example of good practice, it's obvious when you think about it just how problematic it can be for local communities to recover. So, I absolutely echo the point that the Auditor General made latterly about that crucial need for collaboration and a clear implementation plan, a timeline for the implementation plan for the National Flood Resilience Strategy that the Scottish Government have now brought forward, in which we welcomed, I think it was last December.
Just move on to something, I was going to say something new, but it's not new. Paragraph 35 on page 21, we're talking about consistent, comprehensive national monitoring system and data, lack of information. It's something we've been talking about now for years, and we haven't really had resolved. Can you tell us a bit more about the data gaps in flood resilience and what, in your view, needs to be changed?
Yeah, you're right. It has been a recurring theme. And again, I'll bring Fiona in a second if anything she wants to add. But we think this is an opportunity, with the new strategy to support that with a clear implementation plan that encompasses what data is necessary, who's going to provide it, how timely it's going to, and then how it's going to be used, so that a strategy is only that, and perhaps might hold good for a number of years, but the good quality data allows decision makers to know whether it's on track, any alternative interventions that might be necessary along the way, whether it's around how effectively, for example, how flood prevention schemes are performing. And I think you mentioned paragraph 35, Mr. Beattie. That is an important component of that text, that there isn't national information currently on how Scotland's flood prevention schemes are performing. And given the scale of investment that has been made, and maybe come on to talk about this, but as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, £1 billion will be the cost of the first cycle. We're on the cusp of the next cycle too of major flood prevention schemes, but it feels fundamental that we don't have information to allow us to tell whether a particular scheme is working as intended. And that feels, with all the climate change context, and again, not to preempt any further discussion on the Brecon case study, for example, that was designed as a flood prevention system to alleviate up to a 1 in 200 year event. And with the devastating flood that was caused with Storm Babette, that's been reassessed now to holding good for a 1 in 50 year event, and maybe not even as regular as that. So knowing that we have the right data to make good decisions is fundamental, and our report makes recommendations to that effect. So, and again, maybe turn to Fiona if there's anything you want to add.
Thanks, Auditor General. Yeah, I think we would recognise the extremely high level of expertise there is in the sector. We recognise the expertise of organisations such as SEPA, who have clearly this is their kind of domain. And we would expect that those organisations coming together, SEPA, Scottish Water, Scottish Government Councils, they are best equipped to be able to identify what the priorities are. In the report, we've highlighted specific areas that we've identified as key concerns, and the coastal monitoring is clearly one of them, as the Auditor General has said, and also the condition of flood schemes and whether they are actually performing as originally intended. We would expect that they would be priorities within that list because of the information that we've received from stakeholders during the audit. And we would expect them, therefore, to be able to use their expertise to be able to identify the priority order and how they should be addressed, and to put in place an action plan to do that.
So currently, what is the process for post-implementation evaluation?
So currently, individual councils have a responsibility to assess their individual flood schemes. The level and extent of that wasn't clear to us during the audit, and during the audit, stakeholders felt that there was inconsistency across different council areas. So it's not something we specifically evaluated during our audit, but it's something we certainly identified as an issue, and the potential that that gap in the national understanding was actually potentially leading to ambiguity around that. And therefore, if you have that data, as the Auditor General has said, you're able to then set clear action plans to address it, but without it, you're not in a position to do that.
So there is no common standard for measuring the success or failure of a flood scheme?
So the condition survey, as we understand it, is about the actual condition of the flood scheme as opposed to its, I think, an arbitrary success or failure is not necessarily something that came through during the audit. I think it's something that we wouldn't have sufficient detail on to be able to respond to the specifics of that. But there may be others in the team who might want to elaborate.
Thank you. So councils have responsibility for maintenance of the flood defence schemes in their local area, and so councils may have information on that for their own individual flood schemes. As Fiona highlighted, the extent and consistency of that across councils we weren't clear on, because there's no national collation of that information. So we couldn't see through the course of our audit the evidence of how that was assessed at an individual flood scheme level. So that's not to say that the information isn't held by councils, but it's not collated anywhere centrally, and that may mean that there's a lack of consistency across the piece in terms of how that's approached.
Just move on slightly. Do you know what's actually been done to ensure that public bodies like SEPA have enough capacity and resources to effectively provide the services to help and so on for people that are responding to flood issues?
So I think I'm happy to start. Actually, bring colleagues in again in a moment. We do note at paragraph 36 to the report that there are limited financial resources. That's clear. Excuse me. And I think you specifically asked about SEPA, Mr. Beattie. That, so we referenced, for example, that SEPA, in our engagement with them over the course of the audit, highlighted that, like all public bodies, they've had to prioritise the resources at their disposal, and in prioritising, deprioritising other factors. So SEPA prioritised operational flood warning system, and I think, not to question the merits of one choice or another, but you can perhaps kind of see why that might be necessary given the threat to life arrangements that we've become familiar with. But that's been at the expense of some of the annual flood map updates. And the implications of that potential therefore is that councils and some other public bodies are missing some of the information that they might need to support some of their decision making. So I think we would absolutely recognise that resource constraints and prioritisation will be a factor of how public services are delivered. I should maybe turn to Andrew, because I think particularly drawing on some of the commentary that the Accounts Commission has been making about the financial pressures that Scotland's local authorities have been, and what the implications of those might be.
No, thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Colin. I think the latter sort of debate you've instigated there through your question and really does underscore the point, Stephen alluded to in his opening comments, that we've welcomed the publication of the National Flood Resilience Strategy in December last year. But I would really draw committee's attention, I think it's the third or fourth recommendation that we make about the National Flood Resilience Strategy, which is a step in the right direction, but it doesn't have an implementation plan. And if I just quickly allude to some of the things that are in that recommendation, they do directly address several of the latter points you've just raised. So it's seeking the implementation plan we're urging within 12 months should be published, and should have clear actions, targets, indicators and timescales, and a clarification of roles and responsibilities, because those are really what you're getting at, are the things that don't exist very clearly at the moment. And as the Auditor General was just saying, not just at a national level, but also, regrettably, at a local level. And there's no doubt that the pressure that all 32 local authorities are under currently, and that clarification of roles and responsibilities and allocation of funding as part of the implementation plan would make a huge difference to just creating certainty around what was available as regards help and assistance when a flooding event takes place. And as we've all said several times already, they are going to take place, and they're going to take place, sadly, more frequently. So it's really crucial that implementation plan, with the detail that we're asking for, comes forward within the 12 months that we've outlined in the recommendations.
Do SEPA have enough data to be able to effectively carry out their function? We're talking about information being available at council level, but not necessarily being collated in any uniform methodology, or indeed, in some cases, it would appear not being collated at all. How does SEPA then assess what the flood risk is in areas, for example, that have got flood management systems in place? How does SEPA manage to square that circle?
I suspect there may be a question that SEPA themselves are better placed to answer and reassure the committee on their work. And what this isn't is an audit of SEPA's overall arrangements, really more generally about how the need for better data, stronger collaboration between public bodies, consideration of the funding arrangements into the future, as opposed to a particular analysis of SEPA's overall arrangements. But I will pause if there's anything the team want to add.
Just on a slightly different thing, can you tell us a bit more about what the impact of council and staff and other public bodies working with the communities that are affected by or at risk of flooding, What's the impact of that with on the staff?
Happy to have it. Respond to that point, Colin. I would go back to the point I made earlier on. The Auditor General referenced the national standards for community engagement, and I drew the committee's attention to the, I think it was 2019-2020 piece of work that we jointly undertook around principles for community empowerment. When those principles or the national standards are followed, and I referenced the Dumfries and Galloway example a few moments ago, then the impact is wholly positive, because I'm not going to sit here and claim from the evidence that we've got that everything goes 100% perfectly, but good communication, good collaboration, good use of the national standards and the community empowerment principles at a local level makes a huge difference to how local communities can access data quickly, effectively, and recover from flooding events. And I know we've collectively said it a few times now, that really it is a question, given climate change, of when these events are going to happen, not if they're going to happen. They are going to happen more frequently, and therefore recovery is ever more important. And that's why the impact of local community engagement can have a very, very positive impact when it's done efficiently and effectively according to the national standards and the community empowerment principles that I've referenced.
John, in your report, you seem to make it fairly clear that to some extent each flood scheme is operating in a silo almost. There doesn't seem to be a lot of cooperation, transfer of best practice and so on, although you have shown some examples of good practice in innovation and collaboration work, like Study 2 with the Tweed Forum and the Metropolitan Glasgow and Sustainable Drainage Partnership. Why have they been successful and it's not reflected in other areas?
So you're right to reference both case studies, Mr Beattie, and I think what we look to do when we do an audit like this is to draw on examples from across Scotland, of good practice and where progress is taking place or arrangements are working well. And perhaps just really kind of three of the themes from the case study. And I think, as Andrew mentions, about the importance of relationships between public bodies and communities, embedding some of those principles of community empowerment. And then the value of joint working and building in a kind of depth and economy of scale to a particular local initiative. And lastly, as you touch on, when it's working well, share that example. Share the principles of why it worked well so that it can be applied across the country. That's one of the objectives of our work, that we can offer both assurance to support scrutiny, but also of improvement and building on some of the examples and the opportunities in the report. So I think there are many good examples of cross-working across the country, but implementing the recommendations, we hope, particularly around better data, clarity around roles and responsibilities, where there's ambiguity about where responsibility lies for a particular part of the system, that is resolved.
Is there any mechanism for sharing best practice?
Yeah, I think, again, I'll bring colleagues on and actually maybe talk about some of the groups and governance arrangements that are in place and how the system operates, and particularly then from there, the implementation plan that supports the National Flood Resilience Strategy will be so important.
Yes, so there are groups operating in the sector that work to support each other in terms of the action that's taken. What we found, though, is that there's not necessarily that kind of systematic approach to and a formal structure for taking that good practice and sharing it and looking at how that could be replicated in other areas, scaled up. For example, Dumfries and Galloway have a persons at risk database. In terms of when a flooding incident happens, that means that the major responders have understanding of where there may be particular vulnerable groups. but it was stakeholders felt that actually there's a potential for that kind of activity to be replicated at a national level, but there's not necessarily the mechanism in place in order to ensure that that happens. Part of the reasoning behind that may well be the disjointed nature within organisations themselves and how they're actually addressing flooding issues. So at both a national and a local level, there can be a distinction between the action that's being taken around resilience in terms of the civil contingency legislation and the actions that need to take place in relation to that, and the work that flood teams might be doing, or community engagement work that might be happening at a council level. And so part of the recommendations in our report is to look at how actually those services could be delivered more effectively in a joined up way, so that these lessons, these opportunities are actually, there's much more, there's much greater chance or mechanisms, and there's formal structures put in place to actually enable that cross-sharing of ideas and that cross-working. And this is, I think, one of the key things that we identified in the audit is currently missing.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm now going to invite the Deputy Convener, Jamie Green, to put some questions to you. Jamie.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning. I'm going to start by asking a general question. Obviously, Cycle 1 flood schemes you identified, that was 10 years ago. There were 40 schemes in the plan, and the cost was around £350 million to deliver those at the time. You now estimate that to be sitting around £1 billion. That's a lot of money. Is that your estimate of how much it would cost to deliver the 40 schemes if they were to be delivered in full today? Or is that how much you understand the government has now allocated to their completion? I mean, £1 billion is a lot of money.
Well, indeed, it absolutely represents a significant growth in the anticipated costs to deliver the scheme, rather than the funding arrangement. I'll just confirm that is the case. Yeah. So these are the projected costs to deliver those schemes that are going ahead from the Cycle 1.
Okay, of which 8 aren't. Is that correct?
That's correct. And I think, and it's not an insignificant amount, Deputy Convener, either. I think this, just to draw the committee's attention to paragraph 60 of the report, where we there have been schemes abandoned, around £30 million of public money on schemes that aren't going ahead. And I know you're focusing on Cycle 1 at the moment, but it's a relevance to Cycle 2 as well, because schemes will take many months and indeed years to work through planning and preparation. And some of that work will be undertaken at risk by local authorities. So and I think what we are recommending in the report is that there's a resolution or clarity around the funding arrangements, so that Cycle 2 funding is clear, so that we're not encountering the risk of further amounts of time and public money are spent on schemes that are then subsequently abandoned.
I mean, £30 million in sunk costs is a huge amount of money, and we know of communities that have suffered terribly due to flooding, and they're still waiting on support from government. £30 million would go some way, presumably, to help support businesses and households who have really struggled over the last few years. What sort of analysis has been done as to where that money actually went? Who did it go to?
So, again, Rebecca might want to say a bit more of the detail behind why a scheme didn't go ahead, and what would
along the line, that's for sure. I mean, £30 million doesn't disappear overnight.
So I think, just to be clear, I don't think we're alleging any impropriety in terms of those being sunk costs.
No, but contractors, for example, may have been. I can't get my head around how such a large sum of money hasn't actually gone to flood defences or supporting communities. Is sort of the point I'm making.
No, I understand the point, but maybe we can provide a bit of clarity, Rebecca.
Absolutely. So as you recognise, there were initially the start of Cycle 1 scheme, 40 schemes were deemed eligible for funding, and over the last decade, 8 of those have fallen by the wayside, so 8 are no longer progressing. The 30 million in sunk costs is the 30 million from the Scottish Government allocation towards major flood schemes. So that doesn't include any additional money that councils may have also invested in these schemes. The sunk costs will largely be around the design stage. So these are projects which didn't even get to the construction stage. There's a very long lead-in time to these projects, as you can imagine, for large infrastructure projects. And so there's a kind of a long period of design and redesign of these projects before they eventually get the green light and construction begins. So a lot of those sunk costs will have gone into that early design work that happened in the projects that aren't going ahead. In terms of the ones that aren't going ahead, 6 of those are because they didn't meet a deadline that was set by the government and COSLA in 2024, in recognition that there needed to be some kind of cut-off point, really, so that projects didn't remain in development for an eternity. And so they'd set a deadline for when councils needed to notify them that projects would definitely be going ahead, and 6 of those projects didn't meet that deadline. The other 2 were deemed either no longer needed, or the council decided not to proceed with them.
Really helpful clarification. Thank you for adding to that. Yes, I think that makes more sense. That very few spades went in the ground, for example. It was very much costs that were associated with the development and planning and, as you say, designing of these schemes that didn't come to fruition. I'm sure that local communities will reflect on that. I guess another point is had any thought been given to, as if the 40 projects as originally planned had been delivered ahead of significant storm events, would any of the substantial damage that communities faced, could any of that been, would there been any less impact, or could any of it been avoided, for example, had those schemes been in place? Is there any analysis done of that?
I don't think it's something that we looked at as almost a counterfactual, almost through the course of our audit work. It's probably one for, if the committee are interested in pursuing that with SEPA, Scottish Water, or local authorities, if there's a particular area. But not to labour the point, Deputy Convener, but I think just even perhaps the case study in Brecon highlights that it might have been a completely perfect implementation, costs entirely to budget, but yet might not afford the protection that the community required.
That was a significant event, to use the parlance. The scheme was designed for 1 in 200 year events, but we had worse than that. I suppose you can't control the weather, so I understand that. I was quite concerned by reading your report around some of the other funding issues that you've raised, and the one that I think surprised me the most is that we simply don't know. We know how much, more generally, the Scottish Government gives to flooding schemes, but I was surprised to learn that that is simply provided via the General Capital grant funding model, that there's no tracking of which councils get how much, what they do with that money. I was equally surprised that my understanding is that it's not ring-fenced in any way, shape or form. Do you have any specific recommendations off the back of your findings?
I'll certainly bring Andrew in a moment, because I think the role of councils is so fundamental to the implementation of flood defence schemes. And it really, as the Accounts Commission have been reporting for many years on some of the challenges that local authorities have. So we do make recommendations, just before briefly bringing Andrew in, about the need to publish clear model timescales for Cycle 2, looking particularly at the duration of how schemes last. So these aren't, they're not a 12-month cycle scheme, clearly, but whether there are more consistent, reliable arrangements than we currently see. And I think it's evidenced from the point, the scale of change that took place. So 350 million initially intended, that moved to over £1 billion, but for fewer schemes and then for fewer properties. And a real consideration of where does the risk lie. I think currently that the model transfers much of that risk to local authorities.
Thanks, Stephen. I would absolutely agree with that point, Jamie, and I think you're drawing out a really crucial element of the importance of, and I referenced this in response to Colin's earlier queries, the importance of an implementation plan being published with a timeline for the National Flood Resilience Strategy. I mean, that was a welcome development, as I've said already, the Auditor General have said, but an implementation plan with clear timelines and a clear delineation of which schemes are to be funded, when and how, as part of that plan, would go a huge way towards just providing clarity to 32 local authorities, or however many were impacted by the implementation plan. Because at the moment, there isn't that clarity, there's uncertainty, and in the current climate for all local authorities, and obviously the Scottish Government, it's very, very difficult for them to plan ahead in any meaningful shape or form. So a clear implementation plan with timelines and specific notification of allocation and where it's going to go and which schemes it's going to go to would be a huge step in the right direction. The recommendations clearly call for that within 12 months.
Okay, that's a short timescale. I mean, the Auditor General, your report is quite stark in its findings. I mean, it states explicitly that money that was supposed to go towards funding was redirected by councils. Now, was that a decision that the Scottish Government took? Was that a COSLA decision, or was it individual councils who took decisions to divert money from flooding to, for example, settle local government pay settlements, for example? I think you allude to that. But in other words, who do you think made those decisions to divert that money away from vital flooding schemes?
So again, Andrew might want to comment some of the specifics, and indeed Rebecca, who looked at this in detail. But I think you mentioned yourself a moment or two ago about how the funding flows go from Scottish Government to local authorities, whether these are or aren't ring-fenced. I think what we're highlighting is that there's ambiguity in approaches, that Scottish Council's financial positions are challenged, and therefore prioritisation has happened. So I think in terms of who made these decisions, Deputy Convener, I don't think I've got the specific detail within whether it was at committee or council meeting or by officers. If we have that, we can share that with you. But I think as the overall point illustrates, that the model of how funding operates for flood prevention schemes isn't delivering what's intended of it. But I'll pass to Rebecca first, and maybe I'm sure Andrew might want to come in as well.
Thank you. So the allocation of funding for flooding is determined between ministers and COSLA leaders. So there are joint discussions between them in terms of how this funding is distributed. In terms of the redirection specifically of the money towards the local government pay settlement, my understanding is that will have been decided by ministers and COSLA leaders. I'm not sure about the specifics in terms of when and where that happened. But they are responsible for making those decisions in terms of how the money that's allocated through the General Capital Grant is then distributed across councils in Scotland.
Understood. And I'm, again, not passing comment on the decision that was made. It was more about understanding the process, the diligence process by which these decisions are made. Because surely, I mean, I know for sure if I lived in a community that had been ravaged by flood and a defence scheme should have been there but wasn't there, and I then discovered that the local council had diverted money to cover other shortfalls, I wouldn't be overly happy as a resident, as I'm sure many people aren't. So can I point towards Exhibit 7 in your report, which is the table? I mean, the Scottish Government is clearly spending significant amounts of money on the issue of flooding, and that has increased since 2017. It was sitting at £42 million, and council spent £42 million. The year 23-24, which is the last year you've reported, that had increased to £60 million. It is an increase. However, that same graph shows that council's expenditure was nearer 80, so there is a delta of nearly £20 million there. How has that come around, and do we know where the shortfall, if that shortfall was made up, or was that covered by councils? Again, is that dipping into other parts of council budgets to fund that difference?
So again, I'll say a word or two very briefly and pass to Rebecca and Andrew on this. I think it illustrates about who carries the risk if the costs of a project go beyond the funding that's been allocated. And largely that's held by local authorities on a particular scheme. So I think as perhaps set out a paragraph reference, Deputy Convener, that paragraph 54, and perhaps for many of the reasons that the committee will have heard in many sessions in recent years about why costs of infrastructure projects have grown. We repeat many of those in today's report, and they'll be the same for flooding projects as they will for any other large capital projects. But the model that currently exists is that Scotland's councils will pick up the majority of the additional costs over and above the funding. And inevitably that will lead to prioritisation, longer periods of time to implement particular projects. And that's why we step back from really the key finding and recommendation about consideration for Scottish Government, COSLA and other public bodies. Is there a better way of doing this that can deliver projects with improved value for money, implementation timescales than we're currently seeing? But again, I'm sure Rebecca and Andrew might want to say a bit more about that.
Go ahead.
I can say a little bit more about the figures sitting behind Exhibit 7. So I suppose firstly it's important to note that this doesn't cover the entire period that funding was available or councils have been spending in this area, but this was the period for which council information on council spending was publicly available, but actually the funding from the Scottish Government started back in 2015-16, and they've been providing £42 million a year through the General Capital Grant, and it's for all flooding activity. So around about 36 million of that is intended to go towards the construction of major flood schemes, and the remainder, so about 8.5 million, is for broader flooding activity. So that can include flood resilience activity, community engagement on flood activity, etc. So this captures all of that spending, not just on the major flood schemes. You'll see that the government expenditure started increasing around about 21-22, and that was when the government committed an additional 150 million between 2021 and 2026, recognising the increases in expected costs around some of the major flood schemes, and so as a result started contributing more money to the General Capital Grant to go towards funding those projects. It's continued to increase since 23-24, so it's around 88 million in 24-25 and 96 million in 25-26, so that continues to increase. We don't have the corresponding information for council spending for those years. That's not available yet. In terms of the split between, I suppose, where that line diverges between government funding and council funding, because the majority of spend is on the major flood schemes, the split of that funding is 80% Scottish Government funding and 20% the councils are responsible for, and that split is set at the point at which a contract is signed. So essentially, once everything's been signed and sealed legally, the government will then contribute 80% funding towards that major flood scheme. If the costs increase, councils will be liable for that increase, and they'll be expected to pay for that, as well as the maintenance for the flood schemes once they've been built. So some of that divergence there you'll see will be with councils putting in their share of the funding towards these flood schemes. And I think it also recognises that given the long period of time that it takes to bring these schemes to fruition, that spend will vary year to year depending on the stage at which those schemes are at.
That helpful information. I guess the bigger concern, though, is that if the original costs of Cycle 1 have more than trebled to over £1 billion, and Cycle 2 presumably will come with a huge price tag associated with it, to play devil's advocate, have sympathy for the government, where they're going to find that sort of money to implement these schemes. No government can magic £2 billion out of a budget out of nowhere. Therefore, where's the money going to come from? Surely, I mean, we have to invest in these schemes. The government is going to have to find money from somewhere within its overall capital budget. But these are huge sums of money, and I guess people will be concerned that if they're seeing 8 of the last 40 schemes being dropped, will the next tranche of schemes will they be delivered? And you know, when the worst happens, people feel let down as a result.
I think we'll absolutely recognise that, and I think that's why the infrastructure investment pipeline that will set out the government's capital programme intentions will be so key to be clear for public bodies and the public about where the prioritisation will be drawn. Of course, there are limited resources, and that will all be reflected in those priorities. It perhaps takes back, I suppose, to some of the National Flood Resilience Strategy, that it isn't just about the major schemes. There's a sense of, while they will play an important part in flood resilience, it's a part of a much broader strategy, and even the work that some other public bodies, NatureScot, for example, and the role that they can play about land use, natural flood defence arrangements that can be an offer to us, that part of that wider scheme of options that are available over and above the challenging prioritisation for capital projects.
Do you think there's a role for other? I mean, a lot of pressures on councils here, but if I look at two examples of flood prevention or flood cure, if you like, in my local area, one is a Scottish Water project, which is £2.5 million for a major A road, and the other being funded by AME because it's around wall defences on a coastal road, for example. So these are other. It's all public money at the end of the day, of course, but it's filtered its way through different agencies. Do you think there's a bigger role for other parts of the public service to get involved in funding some of this and put less reliance on already under pressure local councils?
I think I'm very clear that'll be a policy decision for ministers and Parliament's scrutiny of budget proposals. But I think what we are clear in the report is that there's a need for stronger collaboration, clarity around roles and responsibilities, and if that bridges into how projects are financed, it's that clarity that's needed.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Commissioner.
Okay, thank you. Moving things right along, I'm now going to invite Graham Simpson to put some questions to you. Graham.
Thanks very much, Convener. I think I want to kind of follow on from the line of questioning that Jamie Green was pursuing. If I can ask you about a specific project, which you do mention in the report, and that is the Grangemouth Flood Protection Scheme. I think it's a very good example of what we've been talking about, of how costs have spiralled, responsibilities have changed. I mean, back in 2015, the cost was estimated to be £108 million. Now, it could be as much as 672 million. And the scheme's not off the ground yet. So, we've got a situation where a task force has been set up. That involves Falkirk Council. Falkirk Council clearly can't afford even a fraction of that kind of sum. Scottish Government are involved. What's your understanding of the situation in Grangemouth? Because it's a major scheme. I mean, if I can give you some sort of figures, it's just this will just tell you the size of the scheme. It'll provide around about 17 miles of flood defences. That involves walls, embankments, floodgates. It will protect more than 6,000 people, 2,700 homes, 1,200 commercial properties, and 14 miles of roads in the surrounding area. This is a massive scheme. What's your understanding of the situation there, and how do you think it should be progressed?
So, I'm not sure I've got terribly much more to add to what you've outlined, Mr Simpson, and as we touched on in the report, that the scale of this project and the anticipated costs of it led ministers and COSLA to take it out of the overall management of the Cycle 1 flood defence schemes because its scale and complexity dwarfed the remainder of those schemes, and that there is a task force has been created and is now under consideration by ministers and COSLA about how and whether to commit the additional funds to take that forward. I don't have any view. It wasn't part of our work as to And ultimately, this will be a policy decision for elected members in Falkirk, along with ministers, about how best to progress the flood defence requirements within Grangemouth. I don't know if Andrew, you'll take on this too.
I mean, similar to Stephen, I don't have any sort of detailed comment about the specific project, Graham, because we haven't looked at, although we've put some case studies in, we haven't looked at in detail at specific projects. But paragraph 54 of the main report does draw out 5 sort of reasons that we received as part of the evidence gathering back from stakeholders about why project costs are escalating, and they clearly have escalated extremely significantly in Grangemouth. But those 5, when you look at them in paragraph 54, do make sense and do ring true. But I don't have a detailed explanation about how the costs have escalated so significantly in the Grangemouth example. But you're quite right to highlight it, because it does form part of the large chunk of the £350 to £1 billion increase that the Auditor General referenced in his opening comments.
Yeah. I mean, the costs have spiralled because it's taken so long, and things do tend to cost more the longer you wait. So we've been waiting quite a long time for this. I guess I'm raising it because it's such a major scheme, and I think it's of national significance. And I don't just mean Scotland, I think UK-wide. It's just my view. I think we could be involving the UK government in this, because it's such a significant scheme and significant to the economy of Scotland as well. So do you think that kind of scheme just shows the complexities of flood protection and the challenges for government at all levels?
I think, undoubtedly, I think we set out in the report that climate change has brought about a change in the strategy. So not just about major flood defences, but a broadening out of approach towards flood resilience. The report also highlights some of the funding challenges, the value for money requirements, and how difficult it has been to deliver upon those in the cycle one. With, I suppose, perhaps also illustrating by the original 350 million or so intended to protect 15,500 properties, but with the scale of cost growth and time, by 2025 we have 14,000 or so properties protected for over £1 billion, another £75,000 per property rather than 22,500. The funding of it, that will be a matter and a policy decision for ministers to determine. I think that's why the infrastructure investment pipeline, when it's produced, whether it's later this year or to coincide with the budget in early 2026, will be so key to see how these major flooding schemes will be prioritised, along with the many other capital requirements that the government will want to deliver. Okay. I'm going to ask you briefly about community engagement, but before I do, can I just push back a bit, Stephen, on your view that flooding, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I'm picking this up is you think it's entirely driven by climate change. I'm not disputing that climate change is a factor, but if you look at Exhibit 2, your exhibit, there are all kinds of different reasons why we get flooding. We've got river flooding, surface water flooding, erosion-enhanced flooding, coastal flooding, groundwater flooding. We've spoken already about where we have developments, housing developments, for example, which can exacerbate the risk of flooding. So would you accept that while climate change is a factor, it's not the only thing that can cause flooding? So I would accept that flooding existed before climate change became a recent scientific statement of fact, that climate change exists and that flooding events are becoming more regular and more significant, and that the recommendations that we make in the report, based on the evidence that we discovered during our audit is that there are many steps that public bodies can take to support not just flood management, as was the clarity of the strategy around the legislation, but of flood resilience. You know, a clear implementation plan, better data, clarity around funding arrangements, Mr Simpson, will all help to prevent, alleviate and help communities recover when they experience climate change. Sorry, flooding, I should say, rather than climate change.
Yes, I understand. Okay, we'll just go on to community engagement briefly. We've touched on it a bit, but page 33, paragraph 77 says, overall, there are major barriers to meaningful engagement for both public bodies and communities. This includes issues and barriers around consultations on major flood schemes, which has spoken about one, as well as engagement around broader resilience activity. So can you give me some detail on what you think the major barriers to this meaningful engagement is?
Yeah, I'm very happy actually. I'll maybe pass to Fiona, because I think, and perhaps highlight Exhibit 9 in today's report at page 35 sets out some of the barriers that were raised by stakeholders in terms of some of those community resilience actions that can be taken. But then also really what we found in the report, as I guess Andrew's mentioned, about the steps that need to be taken to ensure effective community engagement, the application of the national standards for community engagement, so there's the consistency across Scotland, and that there's a underpinning framework that is used to support that engagement, Mr Simpson. But I'll bring Fiona in if she wants to develop that.
Thank you, Auditor General. So there are major barriers for both communities and for those engaging with communities, so in particular councils. So looking at it from the council point of view, there are multiple ways in which public bodies are engaging with communities. So perhaps the key ones to outline are around major flood schemes, but then there's also engagement around broader issues, around kind of broader resilience issues and kind of more, flooding issues that aren't necessarily addressed by flood schemes. So we note in the report that there can be very different responses from communities to attempts to engage. So in terms of the long-term planning, for example, that's sometimes needed in terms of what the local plans might be to address them over the long term. It can be difficult. The councils can be met with disinterest from communities, particularly if they've not experienced flooding recently. It can be something that communities are not necessarily prioritising, and that can make that long-term planning approach more difficult. It can also be met with...
Do you have any examples of that disinterest?
This is information that we've received via stakeholders, and multiple stakeholders have confirmed, those who are working closely with communities, that this can be a particular issue. So around the development of local development plans, for example, it's not necessarily highlighted and prioritised by communities in the way that perhaps public bodies would look for it to be prioritised because of the evidence supporting what the long-term risk is. And this is a crucial factor we highlight in the report, that actually that long-term element of what the risk is likely to be. So if we come back to the Flood Risk Management Act, which switched to this long-term risk planning rather than being reactive, that means by its nature it might be in communities that have not previously been flooded, and therefore those communities simply don't recognise it as a priority, and they may be sceptical about the information that actually there is a risk of flooding in the future. So that can be a real difficult barrier to overcome. I think we've already looked at, in terms of major flood schemes, that can lead to very polarised views within the community. Obviously, these are quite highly emotive discussions around major flood schemes, and therefore that can create its own difficulties and barriers for councils. And we've highlighted in the report that sometimes council staff can be on the receiving end of abuse in those circumstances, because there's very heightened kind of sense of polarised views on it. So councils have a lot of issues to deal with. There's also the issue of skills and expertise. I think it needs to be recognised that actually engaging with communities is a skill, and there is a level of expertise that's needed. And we see organisations like Scottish Flood Forum, for example. In our case studies, we point out how they can support councils to develop their engagement activities. So there's issues around that for councils also. From a community perspective, there can be major issues in terms of getting access to the right information. There can be issues around actually perhaps having the resources to gain alternative options that they may feel actually in order to be able to consider what's being presented to them, if they had the opportunity to get independent advice, but not all communities can afford that, clearly. There are also issues that motivated communities that perhaps beyond flood schemes, but looking at taking direct action in their local areas. Some may be better resourced than others in order to be able to do that. And also there's inconsistency across different council areas in terms of how that might be responded to by public authorities. There's also these wider systemic issues which communities don't necessarily have access to the means to overcome. So, for example, whether it's the availability of insurance, whether it's the ability to afford and access quality flood resilience measures for their homes, and whether it's kind of how you take action if you feel like your local council is not being active enough in terms of addressing the flood risk. And we know in the report that there are some communities who have a sense of abandonment because they recognise the risk, conversely to those who are sceptical, but they're recognising the risk, want action to be taken, but don't feel that that action is actually sufficient to meet the scale of the risk that they perceive or have been experiencing, and there isn't really any recourse, formal recourse to actually address that, as opposed to the kind of the planning process for major flood schemes. So there are these multiple barriers, and that's why we are clear in our recommendations that much more work needs to be done around that community engagement activity, and also to understand how that activity be resourced and the timelines for its implementation.
That's a very comprehensive answer, and I'm very aware of the time, and I know that Mr. Brown is itching to get in. So one more question from me on this subject. There is an issue, isn't there, about when a flood happens, and you're caught up, you're the victim of a flood. You then need instant information. You need instant help, probably from the council. You want them to step in. Have you uncovered any issues there with community engagement, or lack of it?
So the actual emergency response part of the kind of resilience spectrum we didn't focus on in this report. So we were looking at those broader issues leading up to and then the aftermath of it, rather than the actual emergency response element. We felt that that was like a topic in itself that required an in-depth look, as opposed to this kind of whole system approach that we took with the report. My colleagues might have further to add on that.
I think one point I would sort of reiterate, Graham, is just to draw attention to the Dumfries and Galloway example. I mean, again, not claiming it's 100% perfect or was 100% perfect, but the implementation of ward officers just helped that communication at a very local level at a time of crisis, and is far preferable to them not being in existence and communities not having that conduit to information which can otherwise be quite difficult to find and access.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Graham. And I am now going to invite Keith Brown to put some questions to you. Keith.
Thanks very much, Convener. First of all, just to go back to the very start of the discussion, the reference was made, and it's in the report, to instances where it may be that some communities are more likely to advance their case more effectively, if I can put it that way, and in particular high-value homes and so on as well. And the Convener was quite passionate in asking about that. But I'm conscious that you said that there was no analysis or no evidence. I think we could all probably agree intuitively that it would be something that would make sense, but there's no analysis or evidence. Maybe I picked that up wrong, but you said it came up from stakeholders. I just wonder if you're able to see which stakeholders actually raised that.
Can I maybe start and then I'll come to you in a few? And I think maybe reference to paragraph 51 in the report. So it's a reference to cycle 1 schemes. So this is we're coming to the end of that, these major flood schemes. And we say in the report that SEPA has a key role in this process in terms of prioritising particular schemes over others. And this was part of the flood risk management strategy going back to December 2015. And the prioritisation of schemes in the strategy were according to what was a cost-benefit ratio and criteria related to environment and social impact of flooding. Whilst there was a national prioritisation advisory group, we found this insufficient data about how the schemes might have been prioritised, and that brought into the possibility that the cost-benefit ratio will use higher value schemes, higher value properties, I should say, Mr Brown, and the risk that exists. So if we have more detail on that, we can come back to the committee on writing. What we say is there's a risk that the lack of clarity around how particular schemes, what criteria were used, and therefore the recommendations that we have in the report of now that the National Flood Resilience Strategy is in place and the awaited implementation plan is underpinned by really clear criteria, and thus avoiding the risk that more vulnerable groups in society don't get the benefit from some of the flood resilience or flood management schemes. But Fiona, if there's anything, or Rebecca, you want to add?
Yeah.
Rebecca?
Just very briefly on the criteria for the flood scheme specifically. So you asked which stakeholders, Mr Brown. I think we interviewed colleagues in the Scottish Government as well as SEPA and in 5 case study council areas. And so the evidence that we've gathered for the audit came through interviews with a whole wide range of stakeholders who are working in the sector, working to deliver these schemes across Scotland. We make a recommendation in the report that for the government and COSLA need to agree their approach to how these flood schemes are going to be funded in future. As part of that, we want them to set out very clearly the criteria for assessing the value for money of these schemes. I think that it would be fair to say they recognise that perhaps the criteria that have been used in the past may no longer be appropriate, and so as part of reviewing that funding model going forward, we're calling on them to, as part of that, to look at the criteria that they'll use to assess value for money in future, which we would hope would avoid unintended consequences of potentially, for example, being more advantageous to more affluent areas, for example.
I think my concern was that Audit Scotland saying they want the government or public bodies to do this and want clarity and more certainty around some of these things is odd when there's no evidence or analysis to back it up. That's my concern. The second question I had is around schemes, and I'm thinking of one which in an area I used to represent in Milnathort. Just before I was elected, there was a £5.5 million, I think, flood defence, and it's hard flood defences, and it failed at the first time of asking. And subsequently, I think it was through Worldwide Fund for Nature, they did a lot of work upstream, if you like, so with farmers and planting and so on. And we've never had a recurrence of that. Is there any analysis being done about the efficacy of different forms of flood defences in this report?
So there's a clear point in the report, actually. And I should say our recommendations are only that. And the committee, if should it choose to do so, will take evidence from public bodies in our report, and you'll get clarity one way or the other whether or not public bodies accept the recommendations in the report. So these are not mandated in any respect. There's an opportunity to comply or not to comply with any of the recommendations that Audit Scotland makes. In terms of the role that wider land use, I think effectively describing plays, we do touch on that in the report, and again, colleagues might want to come in and say a bit more, but felt like a significant opportunity, perhaps building on your experience in Milnathorpe, that it's not just going to be hard flood defences that will contribute to Scotland moving from flood prevention, but rather to flood resilience arrangements. There are a wider suite of options in place, and Nature Scot in particular are emphasising the role that planting, forestry arrangements and more natural flood defences can have. And again, I'll maybe bring Fiona in first of all to say a bit more about the engagement that we had with these organisations, and how that feeds through in today's report.
Yeah, it's a really important point, and there are multiple approaches, and the efficacy of each approach will, of course, depend upon the specific nature of the area in question. But there is, we provide an example of a nature-based approach for the River Tweed, for example, in our case study supplement, around and the economic value of that and the effectiveness of that approach in terms of looking at how the land is used around that river, and in terms of actually slowing down the peak flow during a flood, so that actually there's that provides greater opportunity for the flood to not basically have the same effect on the communities further downstream. And this is recognised, this kind of sense of how the land can be used is recognised in the National Flood Resilience Strategy. And there's an intention in that land use should be given more prominence, and so should things like blue-green infrastructure, for example. So these things are key within the strategy, and we see some of the issues that were raised with us were around how the criteria for flood schemes, for example, is utilising nature-based approaches, and the difficulties of doing that on a purely monetary value, because it can be very difficult to quantify what the benefits are of the nature-based approach and those nature-based interventions. So there's issues around that need to be resolved, and it's something within our strategy, in our recommendations, that we specifically point out that how that will be included in criteria moving forward needs to be addressed. I will ask if my colleagues have anything further to add to that.
Thanks for that. My remaining questions are really about the nature of Audit Scotland reports, and I'm well aware, I'm the new boy in this committee, but I'm well aware that the recommendations which Audit Scotland make are not mandatory. I understand that point, but I'm equally aware that Audit Scotland is funded by the taxpayer, and it's got to be accountable as well, as all the public bodies. I think it was Nye Bevan that said that politics is the language of priorities, and we mentioned a number of times local authorities and their priorities, and the Scottish Government and their priorities. And I'm just, and maybe because I'm new in this committee, I'm hearing words like Audit Scotland want this and expect this. Nobody elects you guys. These people that we elect to councils and the Parliament and the Government, they've got to take these priorities in pretty constrained circumstances. So is it legitimate for Audit Scotland to come in and make these kind of demands of public elected bodies?
I think that's one for me. Maybe Andrew might want to say about the role of the Accounts Commission. So I'm an office holder of this Parliament, so appointed by the Parliament to provide assurance to the Parliament on public spending. So around £60 billion of public spending, and I do that in two ways. One is through appointing the auditors of public bodies to audit how well public spending, whether it was compliant with the requirements of the budget, and then also in a wider approach to undertaking value for money reviews, all set out in the Public Finance and Accountability Scotland Act. And we absolutely have no powers of intervention. So it's clear, as you say, Mr Brown, that our work is to support insurance and improvement, and our recommendations can be accepted, partially implemented or completely ignored. And that's absolutely at the right of public bodies, ministers and local authorities. And we are accountable. So the Audit Scotland's work and our budget proposals are overseen by the Scottish Commission for Public Audit that Mr Beattie chairs. And our work is reported publicly, both in terms to this committee and on Audit Scotland's website. Of course, we welcome feedback. If we're like any organisation, we don't always get it right. And if that's the case, very keen to hear any specifics about how we can improve, either in today's discussion, and certainly we have kind of clear criteria, not just for members of Scottish Parliament, for members of the public as well. If they wish to engage with us, we're delighted to receive that. But I think Andrew might want to say a bit more about the work of the discussion.
Yeah, no, just to say, completely get the point you're making, Keith. I mean, as you know, and possible other colleagues know, I mean, I've spent a lot of time, 18 years on the other side of the sort of Council, Commission, Audit Scotland table, so I understand completely the pressures, and I know they've only got worse since the time I left local government, the pressures that local government in particular is facing, as well as national Scottish government. But I agree that it's an absolute truth, isn't it, that the bunting doesn't go out, and there's not a celebration when the Accounts Commission goes into a local council to audit the books. But, and I think this is a really important point to make, and we've just conducted a consultation on our work programme for the next few years. We've had a very significant amount of feedback to that work programme that will be reflected, I think, at the Commission's meeting in November. Almost universally, the feedback has been positive. I'm not going to say there's been no criticism, there has been some, but the overwhelming feedback's been positive. So whilst there might not be the celebration of audit and audit's sort of purpose, invariably, when you look at particularly the Accounts Commission's findings, whenever one of the 32 local authorities comes before us, they are followed up, they are listened to, they are respected, and they do make an impact in the real world. That's not to deny that they create pressure in an already pressurised environment, but the overall response we receive is constructive and positive. And whilst there's, as I've said, there's not a celebration, there is a responsiveness to the Commission's findings, and we've overwhelmingly received that back in the feedback to our work programme, which I think I'm right in saying will be that feedback and what goes before the Commission will be public in November. I hope that helps.
I would just say that I'm aware of some councils that have been so incensed by the Accounts Commission's work that they've threatened not to pay the fees for it, which I know is a very problematic thing to happen. And they feel that the burden of scrutiny, and whether it's proper audit scrutiny or not, is now becoming very onerous. Now, I think probably my experience probably predates yourselves, Andrew, but I think since the early 90s, when I got involved, the range of things which either your body or the auditors, Audit Scotland, look at has grown hugely. I mean, I've seen comments on the quality of politicians in different local authorities, and just across, even in this report, the level of comments out with the two things which I would agree with the auditor are really important: value for money and making sure money's been spent properly and legitimately. I think these are crucial things. But beyond that, it's now such a wide range. And you've mentioned, for example, about in this report having some line of sight or some longer, and you've mentioned it as well, Andrew, certainty on strategies going forward. There seems to be no acknowledgement of the nature of funding to the Scottish Government, by which I mean the certainty of funding. It's now certainly more uncertain than I can ever remember. I mean, even this year we're going to have to put a budget up in the Parliament before we know what the settlement is from Westminster. And the chopping and changing from year to year. So I suppose when you're commenting on all these different things now, it's whether sufficient regard is given to the environment. You do mention it, I would acknowledge, in relation to local authorities, very constrained environment they work in, but whether it's 2008, the ongoing effects of the financial crisis, 2010, I'll not say austerity, but constrained public sector budgets now for 15 years, whether it's the pandemic, there doesn't seem to be the recognition, the constraints. And to me, it would make more value, if you want to go into these other areas, to hear that being acknowledged when you also make comments about, what governments, public bodies or councils should do.
So happy to hear that. I think I would recognise the significant financial challenges that the Scottish Government has. And I think we reflect that in almost all of our reporting, that there are very difficult choices that the Scottish Government has to make. We're very clear on the funding environment the history behind that, some of the events that you referred to, Mr Brown. And perhaps for the committee's awareness in particular, we are currently completing a piece of work on fiscal sustainability and taxes that will be particularly relevant to the circumstances that you described. So to reassure you, we are very clear on the environment that the Scottish Government is working in, and we'll consider how we reflect that in our reports.
Okay, my last is a very specific question. It goes back to exchange with Jamie Green, and it's about the nature of the local government funding settlement, which I think once upon a time somebody said there was only 2 people in Scotland that properly understood the entire formula behind it, a bit like the Schleiss v Colston question. But am I to take it, because you were saying about trying to track money allocated by the government to councils for flooding, and how difficult that was? And I don't want to put words in your mouth, so if I'm getting it wrong, please say so. But there was mention of ring fencing. I'm assuming that you would not be supportive so much of ring fencing, just more clarity as to what money was being allocated and for what purpose.
So to be absolutely clear, Andrew, you'll be stronger placed to answer this now. That's a policy decision, so not one for auditors to comment upon about how funding is allocated and what requirements the Scottish Government has in terms of whether an allocation is ring-fenced or otherwise. There's a very important boundary that for auditors, it's our role to consider how well a policy has been implemented, not the merit of a particular policy, whether it's about structures or funding allocations. But we are aware of the wider environment, so would note the Verity House Agreement and the intentions around that, about the placement of ring fencing and the strong views that are held in that. But we're very conscious of the particular boundaries that exist, Mr Brown. But I think it's more for you, Andrew.
Yeah, no, thanks, Stephen. Thanks for the question, Keith. I mean, just to amplify a bit what Stephen said, at an Accounts Commission level, we have been very supportive of Joe Armstrong, our chair, myself as deputy chair, and other members have been very supportive of the development of the Verity House Agreement, the principles behind it, because it potentially does provide the clarity that we've variously discussed throughout this morning, this afternoon's debate. And we've urged the government and COSLA to come forward with the fiscal framework. I know, I think as probably the committee knows, it's close to fruition, but it's not in the public domain yet. So, without stepping over the boundaries that Stephen rightly identifies, as an Accounts Commission, we've been clear that the Verity House Agreement is a good step in the right direction, much as we've commented today, that the publication of the National Flood Resilience Strategy last December was a good step in the right direction for the Scottish Government. But we are keen to see the production and final publication of a fiscal framework to provide the clarity, as I've said already, that is often missing and lacking and causes problems for all levels of government, not just local but national as well. And a clearer line of sight over where funding is coming from and how long it's going to last for would be very, very welcomed by the Commission. Without straying into a whole other series of debates, I mean, there is the possibility that we might end up with a 3-year settlement this year coming forward, that hopefully from the UK Government, that might feed through to the Scottish Government, that might feed through to local authorities, that might feed through to voluntary sector. And we were discussing this just yesterday at the Local Government and Housing Committee, and all of that would be, from the Commission's perspective, a real positive step in the right direction.
Just to clarify, if those things happen in the way that you'd hope they do happen, is it your position that the uncertainty or the vagueness, opacity of how, for example, flooding monies were going to local authorities would be made more clear if these things happen? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I wouldn't like to say that one would automatically follow the other, but I think that what I've just outlined in my last response would provide the global certainty that would be required for local authorities and governments to plan more effectively, and would allow them to look at the recommendations that are made in this report around delineating an implementation plan and giving it a timeline. It would make it easier for them to do that. I guess that's the argument I'm making.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. We've exhausted our questions and we are up against the clock, so I want to draw this morning's proceedings to a close, but in so doing, can I thank you for your evidence this morning and fielding the questions that we've been putting to you. Thanks to Fiona Brannigan, Rebecca Seidel, Andrew Burns, and to you, Auditor General, thank you very much indeed. for your evidence this morning. I am now, in accordance with our earlier decision, going to move the committee into private session.